You're on camera, Matt.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start the next segment of this, and we're going to be talking about the economic and the fiscal implications of diversification in Wyoming among some various NAICS codes. You've got a handout on this. We got some really smart people here that's been working on it, and I'm going to turn this over to Matt Sackett to introduce our expert on it, and we'll take it from there. And you have the floor, Mr.
Chairman, members of the committee, Matt Sackett with LSO. As you might recall, first meeting last year in Saratoga, we started some original discussion and explanations of economic diversification and impacts in Wyoming. From that discussion was the REMI model, which sitting next to me is Dr. Evangelikis from the REMI company, I guess. After that initial discussion last year, some additional funding was provided through the Endow initial appropriation to build out a more full REMI model called the tax PI model, which Dr. Evangelikis can explain. We've ran a number of scenarios that Chairman Madden and some other people had input on to provide kind of a generalized background of what some of these impacts and how the REMI model works. And from here, we can decide, at the committee's pleasure, what further analysis and looks might be necessary. But this is really kind of building on what we did last year to then provide more details and some starting points for diversification and different impacts. So I'll hand it over to the good doctor.
Welcome to Wyoming again. We had a meeting, I think it was in April, right? And co-chairman and I were there, among others. Matt was there. And so I'm anxious to have all the committee get educated on this. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Madden, members of the committee. Thank you for having me today. It's certainly been an interesting and productive discussion that we've been having so far. So hopefully today we'll continue that. So I wanted to talk today about our use of the REMI model, our tax PI model, in looking at the economic and fiscal diversification efforts in Wyoming and what some of those impacts look like. So the goal for today is going to be, again, to analyze the fiscal impact of some economic diversification efforts, through Endow and through other discussions in the state, looking at it kind of under the current tax structure, again using our REMI tax PI model, which I'll get into a little bit more detail about shortly. And what we'll find and what we'll explore today is that under its current tax structure, Wyoming's efforts to kind of stimulate a kind of sectors that are kind of outside the natural resources like oil and gas and mining are going to present fiscal challenges, and that's for a few different reasons. First and foremost, there are no personal or corporate income taxes. Sales taxes and property taxes are fairly low, and there's a heavy reliance on revenue from natural resources sectors. And so what I want to do is, in three parts. First, I want to just introduce REMI, who we are, for those of you who aren't as familiar, and get into a little bit of specifics about what the tax PI model does and how it helps us here. And then I want to look at some of the implications of the kind of economic diversification in a couple of different ways. So in the kind of the middle section of this presentation, I want to look at within Wyoming, look at several different sectors, again, that were based on input from Chairman Madden and some other members of the committee, to look at what are the economic and fiscal impacts of expanding those sectors. In the third section, I want to look, kind of take a different angle and look at a different dimension and focus in on one sector and look at comparing its fiscal impacts under Wyoming's tax structure versus the tax structure of several other states for which we have budgets, and kind of really get into understanding the implications of the tax structure on these fiscal impacts. Just so a little bit of background about REMI. We've been around for closing in on 40 years now. We started off actually as a Massachusetts state policy model, but we soon grew to look at regional modeling all over the United States. We have clients in basically all 50 states. We work with a number of state government agencies, including, of course, the Economic Analysis Division here under the Department of Administration and Information. And essentially what REMI is a policy modeling tool that combines several different kind of modeling methods that really make it a really rich and useful model in looking at both economic policy but also at fiscal policy. And down at the bottom, you can just see a small sampling of some of our clients. You'll see, for example, in the region, you'll see the Macomb, North Dakota is a client of ours, also a tax PI user. So what is tax PI? So basically, REMI provides a suite of different modeling tools that are all centered around a kind of a core model that then has several different potential modules added on top. So our core model is called Policy Insight, or PI+, and that's basically an economic and demographic, and a dynamic economic model for regional analysis. And what the tax PI model does is it takes that PI+ model as its core and then adds on a functionality of being able to calibrate a state's budget to the economy. So in this case, taking Wyoming's budget and saying, what economic factors drive the budget. And so when we look at an intervention in the economy, say expanding a certain sector, we can see, based on the linkages between the economy and the budget, how does that intervention affect not only the economy but the budget as well. We can get into a good amount of detail about what are the individual drivers of the changes in the budget, and that'll be one of the focuses of the talk today. And so just to give you a little bit of background, so I'll kind of explain the core model, kind of the PI+ model first, because that's the heart of it, and then in a couple of slides I'll describe kind of how the tax PI model builds on top of that. So in this slide you see kind of a hypothetical, kind of abstracted version of what the model does. So essentially we take in a great amount of data, largely from the federal government sources, including the census, the BEA, the BLS, a number of others that have detailed state level data, and we generate our own economic and demographic forecasts for a large number of economic and demographic variables. We have our models offer different levels of industry detail based on the NAICS code. The model that you'll see used here today is our 70 sector model. Essentially, you can think of that as the 3-digit NAICS code level. We also offer a 160 sector, which is a 4-digit NAICS code level. So there are different levels of detail that you can get into. And so what we do is we take in this large amount of data, and we process it, and we come up with our own forecast. So the red line that you see at the bottom of the screen is what we call a control forecast. So that's our estimate from now until the year 2060 of what a particular economic variable is going to look like. So for example, population or GDP or employment in oil and gas sector, for example. And the second line, the blue line, represents the outcome of a policy intervention. So if we expand a particular sector, for example, we're going to see a different economic outcome, and we're going to compare that against our control forecast. And so the difference between our kind of business as usual forecast that doesn't include that policy intervention, and then the outcome that does include that policy intervention, the difference between those. So the black dotted arrows are going to represent, in each year, are going to represent the impact. So for example, this might be an increase in jobs in the oil and gas sector, for example. And so we can measure that impact year by year. And so that's kind of the basics of what the model does. I also just want to give you just a brief capsule of kind of the inner workings of the model. I'm not going to get into much detail at all. Basically, the model all I'm going to say here is that we capture all the different pieces of the economy. So we have a picture of what's the macroeconomic picture of the region, so things like output and GDP and the components of those. And then we model businesses, so we model kind of businesses making hiring decisions and making investment decisions. We have a population where we look not only at kind of natural changes in population, but importantly for our discussion later, economic migration, so people moving to and from regions based on economic factors like job opportunity or relative wages. We have price mechanisms, so we have the prices of consumer goods, we have prices in the labor market, so we have wages, we have housing prices, again based on population movement, as well as business costs. And those impact kind of our measures of regional competitiveness. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot view. And so when we put in a shock into the model, then it's gonna flow through all of the kind of, I guess you can't really see here, but there are a number of arrows, and they're basically all these cause and effect of what drives what in the economy. And so that's what's going on inside this is the basic model. And then what I want to show here is now how does tax PI build on top of that in order to look at fiscal impacts. And apologies, it doesn't appear that the arrows in this graphic are too visible. There should be arrows kind of going in a circular pattern between all of these boxes. Yeah, exactly. So you can see those in your handouts. And so basically the way this works is, for example, we start at the top with a change in taxes or in spending or some economic shock. So for example, expanding a particular industry. So that's going to immediately have some direct fiscal impact. So that's going to have kind of a static, what you might think of as a static fiscal impact. But it's also going to have it's going to generate a change in economic behavior. So it's going to change incentives, and so it's going to change economic outcomes. And what tax BI does is to be able to say that piece that says change in tax base and spending determinants. And I'll explain in a second, the calibration of the state's model to the Wyoming economy allows us to capture, how do these changes in the economy affect the tax base? So if, for example, if more people are coming into the region, that becomes a bigger tax base, for example. And so that's going to be taken into account. And so there's a static fiscal impact. But there's also going to be what we call a dynamic fiscal impact that's going to come from this change in the tax base, the change in the number of people who are in the state, the change in the level of economic activity that's available for taxation. And so those are going to combine together to create the full impact on the budget. And what the model does actually after that is to be able to say, okay, now we have now we look and see a change in government expenditures and government revenues. We can feed that back into the economy, and the reason it's kind of circular is that it can kind of loop through and kind of get to a kind of an equilibrium where the fiscal impacts are kind of fully incorporated into the model. I'd like to just stop and ask if there are any questions so far. I want to make sure that everybody's comfortable. Thank you, Chairman. Okay, so I'd like to move on to the second section of the presentation, which has to do with looking at several interventions into sectors in the Wyoming economy and looking at the economic and fiscal impacts. And so I'm gonna look at very simple interventions. What I'm gonna do is add 100 direct jobs into here 4 different Wyoming industries. And so I'm gonna look. I'm first gonna look at putting 100 jobs into the oil and gas sector, and as we'll see, that will be very much contrasted with the fiscal impacts of the other 3 sectors. So I want to show kind of the difference when we look at a natural resource sector versus when we look at any sector outside of the natural resources sectors. And so I'm also going to look at a chemical manufacturing sector. I know that the sector that was discussed was, I think, petrochemical manufacturing. At the level of detail of this model, we can get down to chemical manufacturing. So I looked at chemical manufacturing. I know that there was some questions about wind power. At this level of aggregation, we can look at utilities, so we can at least get a sense of what the impacts in the utility sector would be. And finally, there was a question about food manufacturing, animal slaughtering. So again, we'll look at an intervention in food manufacturing. And so for each of these, I'm going to show what are the impacts on Wyoming's budget, both the revenues and expenditures, as well, and to explain what's driving those changes in the budget. I'm going to show the impact on the economic production and the population movement in Wyoming. So I want to give you a little bit of context for the picture that you're looking at. So this is looking at the changes in revenues and expenditures in the Wyoming state budget. The red line. So here the red line is going to be revenues, and the green line is going to be expenditures. And these are going to be, in each year, they're going to be the difference relative to our business as usual forecasts. So the difference relative to not putting in the 100 direct jobs. And so what we see here is that revenues are going to grow at a much faster rate than expenditures. So I looked here at a 15-year window. So I looked at an intervention starting in 2018 and lasting through 2032. And what we see in 2032 is that revenues have increased by about $14 million, whereas expenditures have risen by just about $6 million. And so what we see here is the impact of the heavy reliance of the Wyoming budget on natural resources taxes. So I'll show you on the next slide. We can do a breakdown of. I'll do a breakdown of the revenue sources that are driving that. So here, let me go ahead and I'm okay, thank you. So if you, I know you can't read it on the screen, but you can read in the handout, you can see that the top contributors to the increases in revenue are all, the four top are all natural resources based. So the federal mineral royalties, natural gas and oil severance taxes, as well as the property taxes on minerals. So we see as output in the oil and gas sector goes up, that increase in economic activity is going to be taxed in a way that's going to capture a good amount of revenue for the state. Now, if you'll note, about 75% of the increase in revenues is based on these four categories. And so we see only so that's about $10 million or so. So the remaining $4 million increase in revenues in the last year in 2032 you'll notice, is less than the $6 million increase in expenditures. And so really the natural resources, the taxes on natural resources are really buoying the impact on the fiscal situation. And so we see, an increase in sales, the combined increase in sales and property taxes on buildings, for example, of about $1.5 million or a little higher, which is a fairly small percentage of the overall increase.
So without those four taxes, the mineral industry would be a losing proposition also, right?
Excuse me, Chairman?
I said without those top four, we'd have a losing proposition with the mineral industry as well, right? As far as the cost versus the revenues.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, if without those sources of revenue, without those sources of revenue, exactly, there wouldn't be much way to capture the fruits of the increase in economic activity that's caused by the increase in jobs. And so here we can look, and apologies, the yellow for the yellow on the screen. But here we can look at, in order to get a better sense of what's driving the fiscal impact, we can look at here we can look at a breakdown of the increase in economic output by sector in the Wyoming economy. So the top difference that in yellow that you see on the screen is the oil and gas sector, as you might expect. That's the sector that we directly increase jobs in, and we see an increase in output. And we see by 2032, we see about a $70 million increase in output. And so that comes, and so remember, we saw about a $10 million increase in revenues that were based in natural resources sectors. So that's a healthy, a kind of a healthy cut of the increase in production is being converted into revenue for the state. In terms of what's driving the expenditures, kind of the increase in expenditures is going to be a combination of increase in population and an increase in state GDP. So here I'm showing you the increase in state population. So here by 2032 we see an increase of about about 530 or 540 people entering the state. And so here we see, for example, we're going to see increases in spending on things like education and healthcare. Now, again, so expenditures are, of course, discretionary. So this is meant to give a sense of what the budget would look like, kind of taking the current situation and kind of projecting it out per capita. And so just to give a sense of kind of the capacity of the budget as currently constituted. Now I want to turn to the next intervention, the intervention putting 100 jobs into the chemical manufacturing sector.
Yeah, go ahead.
Doctor, I'm curious about what are the expenditures that go in? You gave us the resources that come out, but or the revenues that come out. But honestly, I was a bit curious that I would have imagined a jump. If you were going to add 100 jobs, there would have needed to be an enormous jump in the industry to start with in order to need 100 new jobs, right? That something had happened is what I guess I would have expected. But it doesn't appear that way from your lines. And so I'm curious about your total expenditures. What goes into that?
Chairman Madden, Representative Connolly. So let me take a step back and explain what does go into both the scenario that we're running and then what goes into expenditures. So first of all, there's so kind of the exercise is to add 100 jobs kind of in an exogenous kind of way, where we're just saying what if we were to attract a lab or some amount of jobs in the industry, and what would be the impact of that. So that's kind of the thought experiment. Now what goes into both the revenue side and the expenditure side is we work closely with the Economic Analysis Division to calibrate the budget based on the budget data, kind of the latest budget data that they give us. So a breakdown of revenues by category and a breakdown of expenditures by category. And what we do is we link each of those categories to an economic driver. So for example, say the oil severance taxes would be linked to output in the oil and gas sector, or the property taxes on buildings would be linked to physical capital in the economy. On the flip side, we would say K through 12 education would be driven by the K through 12, the population in the K through 12 ages. And so as the economy is shocked, so as we add in the jobs, what we see essentially is an increase in the level of economic opportunity, and in this case also the kind of an increase in the average wages, where there's an influx of population because of these relatively good paying jobs, and so workers are going to come in, they're going to bring their families, and so their kids are going to need to go to school and be educated. They're going to all of the expenditure categories are driven, I think, mostly either by population or by growth in the economy.
Representative Connolly.
Again, I'm just a bit confused, honestly, why on that first chart we don't see greater expenditures almost immediately with having 100 new jobs. I understand everything that you just said in terms of where we would expect those expenditures to be, but why don't we see it in the same way that we see the spike with the revenue? Why don't we see it in terms of the spike with the expenditure and then it flattening out, honestly?
Yes, Chairman, Representative Connolly. So one factor is going to be that the increase in population that's going to drive a large part of the increase in expenditure is going to be happening gradually as people see that the increase in good jobs in the state and come in over a period of a few years. So there's some buildup into the region.
Okay. Continue on.
Thank you, Chairman. So turning back to our intervention now in the chemical manufacturing sector, what we're going to see is a very different story, at least in terms of the increase in revenues. So here again, on the screen is probably easier to see. Again, the red line is the increase in revenues, and the green line is the increase in expenditures. And so what we see here is that for the first few years, the increase in revenues outstrips the increase in expenditures. But after that, expenditures start to rise faster than revenues, and so there starts to be a net fiscal loss in the out years of this scenario. And so by 2032, we see, yes, of course,
Doctor,
Chairman.
you might explain better or explain why that surplus exists in the initial years, like we were talking about, and then after tours, why it turns into that deficit for the rest of the time.
Of course, Chairman. Again, this is going to have something to do with the increase in job opportunity and good job opportunity is going to spark this in-migration, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen all at once, and so there's going to be a gradual buildup. Whereas we're going to see the biggest the biggest increase in the revenues is going to be kind of a fairly a jump that there's a jump in kind of the initial jobs, bringing in kind of an initial burst of new personal income and kind of housing demand in the region. That's going to drive kind of a big initial burst in revenue, whereas the population influx is a little bit slower. But then, given that there's no way to continue to capture the increase in personal income and economic activity, the increase in revenue flattens out, whereas the continued influx of people into the economy keeps expenditure rising more steadily. And so after a few years, the increase in expenditure outstrips the increase in revenues.
Okay. Continue on, Doctor.
Thank you, Chairman. So again, we can look at a breakdown of what are the sources of the increase in revenue in chemical manufacturing. So here what we see is an overall increase in revenues of about a little over $3 million, and about now a large percentage of that is not based on natural resources sectors. So only about I think 11% or so of the increase in revenue is based on factors associated with natural resources sectors. The rest are based on increases in sales and use tax, in property taxes on physical buildings, as well as the federal dollars that are coming in, the expenditure recapture. And so what we see is we see a very kind of a fairly similar increase in expenditures that's driven by largely the same factors of an increase in the opportunities for good paying jobs that's going to bring people into the state. But there's no way to capture the increased economic activity that they bring in as a result. Whereas we saw when we added the jobs to the oil and gas sector, the increase in output in that sector generated a large increase in revenue that greatly outweighed the increase in expenditures. But on the other hand here, the increase in output in the natural resources sectors is fairly small. And so without revenue from those sources, the increase in expenditures begins to outstrip the increase in expenditures. It begins to outstrip the increase in revenues after a few years only. And here again, I'm showing the impact of adding these 100 direct jobs in chemical manufacturing on production. And what we see here is by 2032, we see an increase in output in just the chemical manufacturing sector of a little over $170 million, whereas we saw an increase for in the oil and gas sector of about 70 million. So here we see a much larger increase in output, and the reason for that is that we see chemical manufacturing having relatively higher kind of average labor productivity. So the same direct increase in jobs is going to have a bigger increase in economic output. And now we're capturing a lot. We're not really capturing that economic output as we were when we intervened in the oil and gas sector. And so we're seeing a much bigger impact on the economy in terms of output, but we're seeing a much lower increase in revenues. And so we're not able to keep up with the fact that we're attracting people into the state, and expenditures are rising as a result. And this is, again, looking at the impact on population. And we see about here a slightly smaller number of, slightly smaller, but kind of in the same ballpark of increase in the number in the population. And so that's going to drive roughly a roughly commensurate increase in expenditures in the state. So now what I want to do is look at several other two other sectors to show you that it's not limited to this particular sector. This is a more systematic issue. So now looking at the utility sector, we see again a very similar pattern to what we saw with the intervening in chemical manufacturing sector. So we see the kind of the positive, the net kind of the revenue is net positive for a couple of years more, but revenues again flatten out and expenditures continue to rise and outstrip the increase in revenues. So here we see an increase of about $7 million or so in revenues by 2032, whereas we see an increase in expenditures of about 8.5 or so million.
Doctor, on this utilities, that's kind of based on a current day composite of the utilities that are being generated here. And I think it's important to point out that because a lot of our utilities are fed by the mineral industry, and the mineral industry has the tax structure that we've just gone through, mm-hmm. that contributes to this positive surplus for the first 8 years or so. But if we were to separate out one of the utilities that didn't use any natural resources with the severance tax and the royalties and so on and so forth, that it would not be close to the correct pattern that we see here. Is that right?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, that's correct.
Well, that's what we're getting at, and I think we need, maybe later to get a better picture of that. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm going to take you through, again, I'm going to take you through this exercise one more time, and then when I show you the next sector, I'll have a more abbreviated discussion. But here again, we can look in the utility sector again here as constituted with based largely on the mining sector. So that's why we do see a little bit more of a positive impact, at least early on. than we would in the case where there are utilities that are not based on those. But taking that under consideration, we can here look at, again, breaking down the impact on revenues and look at the component parts of that increase. And so again, we're going to see increases in property taxes on buildings, in sales taxes, as well as the federal recapture as being the primary drivers, and natural resources sectors account for about 20% of the increase in revenues. So that's more than what we saw with chemical manufacturing for the exact reason that we just discussed. But it's still a fairly small percentage of the increase in revenues. And so again, what we see is not only that revenues in the long term don't keep up with expenditures, but what we see is that if we look and see the line that's there's only one category that's really consistently rising. Most of the other categories rise, but then kind of level off. And so we see there's a very kind of narrow base where the revenues are really kind of being continued to drive upward over time, whereas expenditures are continuing to rise over time with the population influx. And so here again, we can look at one of the main drivers here as production, so kind of economic output in the utility sector, which is going to be again by the end of this window in 2032, an increase in economic output in the utility sector of about 110, 120 million, which is again greater than the increase in output when we looked at an intervention in the oil and gas sector. But just as before, we're seeing a much less of that increase in economic output being converted into revenues. And again, here we can see the increase in population. So here, these utilities jobs bring in about 730 or so jobs by 2032. So there are even more jobs. There are even more people coming in this case than we saw in oil and gas or even chemical manufacturing. And so this is certainly going to contribute to the even larger increase in expenditures that we see.
Senator Case has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along the co-chairman's line of question a little bit earlier, the population increase that would happen, if you were to pick and choose what kind of generation would be developed in the utilities sector, it could have less population. For example, coal plants, they're very labor intensive. They have a huge labor force. You got labor force in the mines. Gas turbines are labor intensive. Wind, on the other hand, is not very labor intensive on an ongoing basis. So if the increase in utility jobs were exclusively, say, wind jobs, this would look very different. And that kind of fits with what he said before, but I think it's even more dramatic with the idea of population, taxes paid, on and on. Could you comment on that, please?
Chairman, yes, Senator Case, thank you. Yes, I think that's true. We could think of a scenario that maybe you're thinking of. Instead of adding jobs directly, we add a certain amount of increase in economic output, and then how many jobs are needed to produce that output. And certainly, if we're thinking about wind, there are going to be less jobs that are needed. So there's going to be a smaller direct increase in jobs. And so I haven't run that scenario specifically, so I don't want to speak too precisely to it. I would conjecture though that we would still see maybe the net positive revenue impact would last for longer, But I do think in the long run, I think that the increase in expenditures would eventually start to outstrip it. I think in thinking about this, I think the kind of the best scenario would be very highly productive but low-paying jobs, because the low-paying jobs is essentially, in terms of bringing people in, they see a lot of low-paying jobs. There's going to be less of a draw, and so you're going to be producing more output, but you're going to be bringing in relatively fewer people. I think that ultimately it's going to be perhaps a bit more of a Band-Aid, at least under the current tax structure. But I do think that you're correct that it would certainly mitigate the kind of the net losses, at least early in the early years, because it would bring in less population and therefore less increase in expenditure.
Senator Case, follow up.
I do find it fascinating that our best choice for economic development strategy is the one that brings in the least people. I mean, I think that's just absolutely fascinating.
Senator, I agree. It's a unique situation, and yeah, I've spent some time thinking about this, having worked with the Economic Analysis Division in our discussions, and in preparing this presentation today, and thinking about kind of what the best scenario is for in terms of fiscal impacts versus economic impacts, and that there seems to be somewhat of a trade-off in terms of if you bring outside of the resource sectors, if you bring in great paying jobs, then you're going to see a large increase in population that is going to increase expenditures, but you're not going to be able to capture the fruits of that increase in economic activity and population. And so, yeah, there's an inherent trade-off that's been created.
Just one more final.
I don't know if I want to let you talk anymore, Senator Case. Go ahead, Senator Case.
Thank you, my chairman. But if you kind of play it back through on the utility sector with, if the jobs are in an area that has value added with Wyoming, say mineral resources, then you get the double whammy of the taxes from the mineral industry resources. And that is where perhaps the most powerful thing is not the contribution of the utility workers, but it might be the contribution of the mineral production and the severance and those kind of things that come off that, which we get none of that with wind energy.
Yes, that's correct. Under the current chairman, Senator, yes, I would agree with that.
Anything else to drive the point home, Senator Case? Any other questions? Representative Connolly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back up a level because I'm still confused about this population variable. That when I saw the first chart, I made the assumption that these 100 new jobs would become whatever it was, the first figure, 420, based on bringing spouses and having kids, ultimately over 15 or 20 years. But then that didn't make sense that your utilities folks are going to be procreating more than your oil and gas people. So again, I'm curious about where are these other people that are based on the static variable of 100 new jobs? So why does 100 new jobs in one of these examples mean 420 in one industry and 720 in another? When we're not talking about the expenditure, we're just talking about population.
Yes, Chairman, Representative Connolly. Yes, so and something I probably should have pointed out earlier. So the REMI model is a dynamic kind of general equilibrium model. So when we put in the 100 jobs, that's going to have so the first part of my answer is that those 100 jobs are going to lead to an increase in jobs that's greater than 100. So if you have new jobs, you have people earning income, they're spending more in the state. That's gonna generate jobs. The business, those businesses are going to be relying on their supply chains to the extent that their supply chain is within the state, and that's going to have a positive impact on jobs. so that like in kind of economic speak, there's induced and indirect and induced jobs. So impact on the supply chain, that'll increase jobs, increase in kind of local spending where a local grocery store or a local mall, for example, might be able to expand. So the 100 direct jobs is going to lead to an increase of more than 100 jobs in total. And the way that we look at the determinants of population kind of inflow is going to be as those jobs, both the direct and the other jobs, are created in Wyoming, then they're going to attract the population, both through kind of just the increase in economic opportunity, but also, especially in these first few examples, an increase in kind of the average wage, and so you're going to see, that's going to drive the increase in population.
Sorry, but
Representative Conley.
I still don't get why bringing in 100 jobs in utilities will ultimately give us 750 more people versus 100 jobs in oil and gas, which will give us hundreds less. I mean, the examples you're giving is you're going to be going to the mall, you're going to be, buying services in town. You still start with that 100 people. Why is it that a utility job brings in so many more, even by factors, of additional people than with oil and gas?
Doctor?
Thank you, Chairman, Representative. So I wish. So I don't have for you here in the slides the kind of the breakdown of where the jobs are coming in. So I can't speak to that specifically, but I'll say that there are several factors. So one of the factors is to what extent is the supply chain for the direct jobs, the sector that we're directly hitting within the state. So, for example, the utilities, as we discussed, does rely somewhat on the mining sector for the fuel that generates the power, and so to the extent that those jobs are going to be increased in the state relative to chemical manufacturing, where chemical manufacturing there's not a whole lot in the state, relatively speaking, and most of it is imported. And so the supply chain jobs in the case of chemical manufacturing would be maybe leaking, the supply chain jobs may be leaking out of the state, whereas more of the supply chain jobs generated by the increase in utilities would stay within Wyoming.
Okay. All right. Continue on, Doctor.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Representative.
Yeah, this next part's the driving the point home, I think.
Exactly. So I have just one more quick scenario here, and then we'll move on to comparing the different states. And I think that will really drive the point home. So here we're finally going to look at, again, adding 100 direct jobs into the food manufacturing sector. And so what we see here is a similar pattern again. We do see that the revenues kind of the increase in revenues does outstrip the increase in expenditures for the longest of these last three scenarios. But what we see is that both of the increases are relatively small. So where we were looking at increases in expenditures in the $5, $6, $7 million range, in this scenario we're seeing an increase of just over $1 million, and an increase in revenues in that same ballpark. And so what's going on here? Why are there so many? Why is the increase in revenues and expenditures so much smaller? On the revenue side, so both of them are driven by the fact that the food manufacturing sector is a relatively lower wage sector, and so that's going to impact the increase in revenues because there are these new jobs, but the increase in income that we're seeing in this scenario versus the previous scenarios is a lot smaller, and so people have more money in their pockets, but relatively not quite as much more money as they did before. And so their increase in, in consumption, in what they're spending, and for example, their demand for housing is not going to be as strong because they're kind of the sources of revenue, like the sales taxes and the property taxes, are not going to be capturing as much because there's not as much consumption, there's not as much increase in housing demand, for example. On the expenditure side, what we see is that these lower paying jobs are less of a draw for people coming into the state. And so on the next slide, I'll show you just to confirm here the increase in population is only going to be 170 people. And the reason for that is because there is an increase in job opportunity, but the jobs are fairly low paying. So it's going to be, again, less of a draw for people to move into the state. And so that's going to mean that the increase in expenditures is relatively lower than what we saw in the previous scenarios. And so as we discussed earlier, there ends up being somewhat of a trade-off when we're looking at intervening in a sector that's not a natural resource sector. If we bring in very kind of high wage jobs, then that's going to be good for the economy in terms of driving up economic output. But it's also going to mean that there are a lot of people who want to come into the state. The population is going to rise, the GDP is going to rise, and that's going to push up expenditures relatively quickly. But we won't be able to capture the increase in the increase in economic activity in terms of revenues. And so that's one side of it. On the other side, if we have an influx of low-wage jobs, we see an increase, a positive, kind of net positive impact for longer. But that's just because we're keeping expenditures low, the increase in expenditures low. But we're also the increase in revenues is also fairly low. And actually, in these first 9 years, where we see the increase in revenues being higher than the increase in expenditures, on average, it's only higher by 200-something thousand. So it's a minuscule part of the budget, and so it doesn't really have a very large positive impact. And so what we see is we end up with this trade-off of, do we want to bring in these higher paying jobs, which are good for the economy, but raise expenditures very quickly, or do we want to have these lower paying jobs that don't quite spur the economy and kind of growth in the economy, and keep expenditures down, but not to the extent that it's extraordinarily helpful. So just on this next slide, just to confirm, you'll be able to see on your handouts that the increase in population is I did add this slide in. I believe this will be okay. This will be distributed electronically. So I do want to turn finally to our third section, where we look at a given intervention in one sector and look at its fiscal impacts under several different states' tax structures. So here we're going to look at an intervention in the chemical manufacturing sector. It'll be a slightly different intervention, but it's of the same sort of adding jobs. And we're going to look at the impacts on Wyoming's budget, in Wyoming's economy, under 4 different states' tax structures. So we look at Wyoming to see kind of what we've just been seeing. I think we compare that to the impacts given Utah's tax structure, given North Dakota's, and given Kentucky's tax structure. So here we can first see, if we use Wyoming's budget, we see the picture that we've seen before. The gray line is the increase in revenues. The yellow line is the increase in expenditures. So this is the story that we've just been seeing. So revenues increase faster than expenditures for the first few years, but then slow down. On the other hand, if we look at, for example, if we look at the same intervention using Utah's budget, we see an increase in revenues that outpaces expenditures and continues to do so. And that's again because Utah has a personal income tax, so it's able to capture the income of the newcomers. It has a somewhat higher sales tax, and it does have a corporate income tax, so it's able to capture the fruits of the economic output coming from the increase in economic activity. And the story is going to be very similar with North Dakota's budget. Their taxes aren't quite as high, so we see revenues outstripping expenditures by somewhat less in the long run, but we still do see revenues continue to rise roughly the same rate as expenditures and at a level just a bit higher. And we can see the same story occurring in Kentucky for largely the same reasons, that the tax structure is able to capture the fruits of the increase in income and the increase in economic output that Wyoming's tax structure is not able to.
So,
Sure.
so I think to reiterate this, what you've done here with these 4 graphs is really transplant those 100 workers into these other 3 states and compared what the outcome was fiscal-wise to the state as a result of that, right? And
Chairman, that's correct. So this is still using the model of Wyoming's economy. So this is still Wyoming's economy, and we're just superimposing the tax structure of these different states and looking at the fiscal impacts.
And all these other states, Kentucky, Utah, North Dakota, have personal income tax, corporate tax, and what else?
Chairman, also somewhat higher sales taxes, and probably other factors, but those are, I think, the main drivers.
Are there any states that are like Wyoming's where they don't have those taxes? I mean, I'd like to see a comparison with another state that's similar to and I'm sure the projection would be mirrors Wyoming's projection of not being able to take advantage of those revenues.
Chairman, yes, that would be interesting. I think we have access to to several budgets. We don't have access to budgets for every state.
Perhaps Alaska?
For example, Alaska would be an interesting comparison. That's not something that we have prepared, but that would be very interesting.
We got a question down here. No? Okay. Anything else?
Chairman, I think that wraps it up. I think that I'll just reiterate, under the current tax structure, kind of efforts to diversify the economy to try to spur growth in these other non-resource sectors does present a fiscal challenge. And this is kind of illustrated both looking across a number of sectors as well as comparing Wyoming's tax structure to the tax structures of other states.
Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I saw an analysis a little earlier this spring that was looking at the situation in Park County. There's a company there that we've underwritten called Cody Labs. And I don't know if that analysis came from this model or from yourself, but basically that showed the same thing, that if because of Wyoming's efforts to subsidize that company and give it startup expenses and on, quite a bit of subsidy, overall that turned out to be a net loss to the state. And that if that same injection of economic activity had happened in any other of the scenario states, I don't know if they were the same 4 states, but they had 4 different comparisons, and I think they were all surrounding us, actually, if I remember right. But this same activity that we undertook for this company called Cody Labs, if Utah had undertaken it, if states around us had undertaken, it would have been a success story. Here it's actually a big failure because we end up spending and losing opportunity because of the effort. Did you do that analysis?
Chairman, Senator, yes, the Economic Analysis Division did do work on that do work on analysis of that project. I don't want to speak to it specifically. The interventions that we saw in this last section of the presentation were of a similar sort to that. I don't know if they were the exact same scenario, but it was a very analogous scenario to what you saw. And that was done with the tax PI model.
Is there a case?
So that was, in essence, the same analysis done by our own in-house people about a more particular narrow subject, I guess.
Chairman, Senator, yes, it was looking at Cody Labs, and I do believe it came to analogous conclusions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Further questions from the committee for the doctor before we get one? Mr. Co-Chair?
Yeah, maybe just one. I think one takeaway we should maybe try to get from you is, the robustness of this model when it comes to one NAICS code manufacturing to another NAICS code. And, we did a little bit of that day in Cheyenne. But I think I'm not putting words in your mouth when I say that you don't learn a lot more by going to other manufacturing sectors. They all turn out to be pretty much a money-losing deal from a cash flow standpoint as far as the state is concerned. Is that right?
Chairman, yes, I think that's accurate. I think for the kind of systematic reasons that we discussed, whether the manufacturing are high-paying or low-paying jobs, those are going to run into kind of different difficulties. But they're both end up going to be fiscally, they're going on net they're going to be kind of fiscal losses.
And I want to urge the committee not to dwell too much on one specific industry or project that the state took on, because the culprit, if anything we've learned from this presentation, is our tax structure. So any project that the state has taken on and subsidized as economic development has been somewhat of a failure in Wyoming's economy because of our tax structure. We cannot capture. So I don't want to pick on one particular project of the last recent years, because we can talk about data centers, call centers, anything that the state has been invested in and tried to spur on and provide jobs and economy benefits for our state, because the culprit again is our tax structure. We're just not set up. So if we're going to address anything on this committee, it should be that tax structure, and that's a hard sell, as I've talked about before. How do you sell the public on the idea and the concept that, gee, we're too dependent on minerals? We tax minerals very well, but we don't tax ourselves that well. Anybody buy that?
Mr. Chairman, there is a policy thing, though. When you're in a hole, and you should stop digging. So the policy thing is we shouldn't be doing these kind of subsidy projects until we do get a different tax structure. I'm not sure that's even conceivably possible. But we should stop digging.
Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this information is fascinating. I think it can be really valuable. But I am curious if you ran the numbers, or if you could run the numbers with doing some of the policy changes that the chairman is talking about. So what would it look like, for example, if we got rid of a manufacturing tax exemption? What would it look like if we raised our sales tax by 1%? Things like that. Instituted a corporate income tax that is comparable to the states that you use. Just one of those variables change. What would it look like? That would give us some really valuable information about interventions that are possible.
Chairman, Representative, I very much agree. I think that those are very doable in the tax PI model, and I think those would be fruitful.
This is the challenge of this committee, and this is what Co-Chairman Matt and I have talked about for the last year or two, is how do we educate the public on what we've found out or what we've discovered or what we've known all along, some of us for quite some time, is our tax structure. Just as you look around at surrounding states, we always tout the fact that we don't have a corporate income tax. We don't have a personal income tax. this is a great place to retire. This is a great place to invest and start up a business. And yet we lag behind our surrounding states that have all these things that we don't have as far as corporate tax or income tax or and I remind the committee that this is being shared around the state via the broadcast, and so I'm sure the people back home are looking at this revenue committee. Have to remind them that this is the revenue committee, that this is what we discuss and we talk about. But I'm sure they're thinking in their minds right now, what are they doing? They're talking about increasing my taxes. And Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask, have you given this talk to the Endow Committee? And are they using this kind of analysis in their recommendations for us?
Chairman?
Doctor?
Thank you. I was very glad to be able to go to, I don't know if it was the most recent, but to maybe a few months ago to an Endow meeting where I haven't given this presentation in that forum, but I think that using this model in that forum as well as in this forum, I think would be very fruitful. I think to the extent that they can work together. I know that that's a challenge, but I think that it's a useful tool in both settings.
I will add this. In our prior presentation, Co-Chairman Madden and myself, Director Noble from Revenue, as we saw this presentation a month ago, or not that long ago, but anyway, we discussed that very thing, Representative Hallinan, and the fact that anybody that's in charge of purse strings for the state of Wyoming should have this presentation. It should be foremost on their minds of how we're going to access this pie-in-the-sky forecast of jobs, additional revenues will flow into our state. Until we do something about our tax structure, it's just not going to happen. I mean, that's the reality. It's just not, we can't capture it. We just don't have the ability to capture that revenue. So good point, Representative Hallinan, and we've discussed that. SLIB board, Endow, Business Council, anybody that's controlling purse strings or dispersing monies to programs or to projects, economic development, in the name of economic development, should have this presentation. There's no doubt about it. Further discussion from the committee for the doctor? Mr. Co-Chairman.
I guess what my question would be is, where do we want to go from here? I think Representative Conley had some ideas that maybe you can monkey around with, Doctor, and see what would work. That might be helpful for, showing it to the Endow people if they want to hear it. I think I sent a invitation for them to watch this today, so maybe they're all watching it right now. I don't know, but it's important stuff. It's very valuable stuff. I had no idea a year ago when we were meeting in Saratoga that this would turn out to be such a enlightened presentation that tells the whole story from a general input-output equilibrium type system, and it's just exactly what we want. I think, what I would hope is when they start passing money out, just like the co-chairman says, that let's ask a question first. What's it going to cost us in the long run? How much more do we have to pump out of the mineral industry to pay for these bills? And that's what we've been doing all along. And well, anyway, it's good stuff, and I'd be interested in any of the other committees' members' ideas like Mr. Hallinan and Ms. Conley has.
Senator, wow, sorry about that. Senator Case, we'll go to you and then.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go back to the utility industry, and as the utility industry is in this model, I'm going to assume it's all utilities. I'm going to guess that. So it's electric, gas, maybe even water. So if I had my dream, I would focus on the utility sector that's actually very powerful in Wyoming, which is the electric sector, where we export about 85% of the production there. In fact, it might be the largest single exporting sector in Wyoming. And if we were to drill down on those increasing that portion of the utility sector, so we've got to drop down another zip code, I would imagine. And then we also model how we increase those exports, and whether we do it with wind energy or we do it with some other form of industry, and under different tax structures regarding things like wind energy, for example. We could do it with our very low tax structure that we have now, or we could do it with a better tax structure that brings more benefits to Wyoming's people. So we could model that, and we could really create something about the wind industry to really understand a bigger picture of what's going to happen.
Chairman, Senator, I agree. Actually, with the, as I mentioned before, with the 160 sector, the 4-digit NAICS version of the model, you can get down to the like electric power generation. So that's doable. Chairman, not directly, but we can. There are ways of what we call creating a custom industry in the model to kind of modify the supply chain. So that's would take a little bit more work, but I think is also doable.
Senator Case. Follow up?
The only follow-up I'd say is that I think that is doable, because one thing we do know, that any additional generation that's going to happen in Wyoming in the next decades is largely going to be from wind energy, and that will displace other generation in Wyoming. So that's ought to be a simple assumption to make. Now, I will say there's a bit of an exception for renewable solar. There's a couple of big projects on the drawing board, one that's actually been permitted, I believe, but it's only 80 megawatts. So compared to the thousands of megawatts of wind energy, which are going to be, you can say that's going to be the future generation, additional generation. So you ought to be able to model that.
Chairman, Senator, I agree. I agree.
Representative Obermuller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In looking at the various sectors that you're analyzing, in the non-energy sectors, is there a REMI model that can be made of what our trade deficit relationships are in these other sectors with companies that are based out of state?
Chairman, Representative, yes. So actually, in the model, we estimate trade flows between Wyoming and the rest of the country by industry, and we can look at that's in our baseline forecast, and so that drives economic impact, and we can also look at changes in imports and exports as a result of these interventions. Absolutely.
Further discussion for the doctor before we excuse him. And Matt, you've been pretty quiet. Anything to add? Nothing. All right. Okay. If no further discussion, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Any other departments? Revenue? Anything to add? Discuss? Okay, we'll leave it up to public opinion now. Comments? We have a few takers. Come on up, Buck. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Pleasure to be here today. I just wanted to quickly.
You are.
Oh, excuse me. I'm Buck McVeigh. I'm the executive director of the Wyoming Taxpayers Association. Excuse me. But I just wanted to add just a couple things to this presentation, and it adds validity to a chart that I think you've all have seen that the Economic Analysis Division put out, which shows that we really struggle in our state to provide services with the amount of taxes that we collect, non-mineral companies and families. I did testify before the Endow Council, might have been back in January, to just basically tell them that I think that we do need to have a discussion on the tax structure and diversifying the tax structure if we're looking at diversifying other economic activity. And I'm not sure how it was received, but anyway, I
You still
did.
have a job?
I do, yeah. But, and I'd also remind this committee that much of what we saw intricately displayed here today is not necessarily a new deal. If you go back to the Tax Reform 2000, much of what was parlayed this afternoon is clearly spelled out in that report. Our tax structure is kind of messed up. And, you know, when the times are good in the mineral patch, we tend to just forget about it. But when things tighten up, we're back to the same discussion. So I appreciate the effort this committee's giving to this topic, and look forward to seeing more to come. So thank you.
Questions for Mr. McVeigh? Senator Wassenberger. Way down.
If he would provide us, I believe you guys, the Wyoming Taxpayers Association, provided a study of essentially this issue not too long ago, and if you could provide maybe that.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to do that. We have been working on a narrative piece to accompany this chart, and I think it helps explain, with the help of Dr. Liu, I think the material will help kind of explain the situation of what we heard today in a little maybe more understandable format.
Appreciate that. Any further discussions or questions for Mr. McVeigh? One,
Well,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, I guess one. And maybe, Buck, you can remark as to whether you agree with it or not. But I worry that we don't want to leave this discussion with the idea that the only industry that can work in Wyoming where cash flows for us as a state is the mineral industry, because there are a few industries that have extremely high capital labor ratios, okay? Very high capital, very low amounts of labor that will cash flow, you know, and I am sure if the good doctor runs wind, if he can get the numbers for the coefficients he needs for wind, that will cash flow, because it's a very high capital labor ratio. And I went through this once when I had a presentation to make at Laramie at a conference on wind, that each one of those turbines, everybody looks at these 1,000 turbines we have and they say, well, there's a turbine and there's a turbine, but I look at it as there's a school pupil there and school pupil, because they do pay enough taxes, each turbine, to pay for one school kid in just the education portion of that. And the other thing that's great about it is they hardly bring any kids with them, because there's only 100, we only have 100 wind employees in the state, but we have 1,000 turbines, roughly 40 students. So we have 1,000 turbines, 1,000 students that can be educated with that property tax money, but we have to deduct 40. So we only have 960 we're paying. So there's a benefit to that. But those industries are few and far between. Another one I have looked at is the data storage industry. You know, these companies that have clouds and stuff like that. That's high capital labor ratio, and we really benefit, especially with that one, because what I'm understanding is most of the labor comes from Colorado, and their kids are educated in Colorado, but they come up here to work in these data storage places. But so anyway, that was the only thing I wanted to add, was that there's some industries with high capital labor ratios that would work in Wyoming, but unfortunately, that's not where it's at right now.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Representative Allen then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if the members of the committee have given consideration to not simply raising taxes on all the entities that we tax now other than the mineral industry. How about reducing the taxes on our minerals if we want to have an equitable balance? I think that is something that I have brought up before, and I think it's a good idea. I think we need to look at that as much as we need to look at increasing sales taxes. If we're going to increase the sales tax, let's reduce the tax on coal, the severance tax, so we can have a fair balance. So I think that's an issue we need to look at in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further discussion? Questions for Mr. McVeigh? None? Okay.
How about on that last comment,
Your microphone light's on. You want to comment?
if I could?
Center case.
So the problem is, though, that we have a need for revenue, and we have to get it somewhere. There looks like there are industries that we should be able to do it. These highly capital industries like wind would be a good place to get some revenue. But if we lower the mineral tax rates, we compound the problem that we have now of a revenue shortfall. And it's in spades. A 1% reduction in severance, for example, would be an astronomical blow to our state budget. So we have to figure out a way to do this. There's no soft landing. You can't, sales tax, it takes about maybe a penny sales tax, we might get $100 million, maybe, roughly. And then you want to back off the severance tax by the same amount, or property taxes on the mineral industry, or what have you. The problem becomes is that sales tax, there are more detrimental effects of the sales tax because people buy out of state and shift the taxes and all those things. At least the mineral tax, we were able to fairly collect it, and it doesn't cause a change in production considerations. That's the exact same thing with the wind power. If we increase the tax on wind, they can't go anywhere else. We've got the best wind. It's a minuscule part of the amount of the worth of those turbines and the amount of revenue they bring in. That's where we should be paying attention to our tax structure. But if we just give the money away, then we have nothing for the future of Wyoming's people. And I would hope that we are not thinking about reducing mineral taxes at this point. We do need to diversify, and we need to find other ways to get revenue. But that doesn't help us. That makes it worse.
You're talking about digging a deeper hole, and you're already in the hole.
Two holes, we'd probably be throwing money away, and then we'd be subsidizing things that don't bring any money.
Thank you, Senator Case. Further discussion? Anybody else in the public like to testify? Let's take, we'll take you first, Tammy, and then we'll take Representative Miller. I'm putting you before a representative. I want you to know that.
I'm Tammy Schroeder, Wyoming Education Association. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. This is a softball for me because what we just saw in the last 4 slides presented indicate what our survey told us last year, and I wanted to call your attention to that again. And if you'd like me to resend that survey to you, I'm happy to do that. And in that survey, a couple things stand out. One is that the questions that we asked in that survey all pertain to helping us figure out the education deficit problem that we have in this state and how we can continue to fund education at the high quality that we're giving kids and pay for it. Well, in the survey that we did, all the questions revolved around increasing taxes to pay for education. So it would be tax money that specifically went to education. And the voters in the state, whether they were Republican, Democrat, or Independent, overwhelmingly, 78% said yes, they would like to see a tax increase to support education. So when we break out those things that they said they would be willing to pay for, 67% of the voters said, that we surveyed said they would like to see an increase in state tax on wind energy production. So I know we've talked about that, kicked it around a little bit today, and it sounds to me like from what you said, Co-Chairman Madden, that that's a great revenue generator. Of course, we like to tax other things, so increasing state tax on mining and oil and gas, 63% said they wanted to see that. We know that there's not much there. But the other interesting thing was almost 60% said they would like to see an increase in state sales tax. And so I think these are things that we've been talking about today, and we've heard a lot about them. And I just want to remind you that our survey, which was valid and it surveyed a wide spectrum of voters in the state, and plenty of them, according to the statistics, told us the direction that we need to go. I'm happy to share that with you again. And if those results don't appeal to you, maybe somebody else could do a survey that would bring out the same, different results. But we feel very confident in this survey, and I'd just like to remind you of it. So,
Thank you,
again, for
Tammy.
any questions.
Questions for Tammy? Any questions from the committee?
Uh-oh.
Oh, we got one. Don't go anywhere yet.
What was the
Senator
number
Casey.
on wind again?
67% of the voters, actually 72% Republican, 61% Democrat, and it was a little bit higher than that for independents, but I can't remember.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to be clear, is it the position then of the WEA to raise taxes on wind, and if so, by how much?
Chairman Peterson, Senator Ellis, thank you for the question. It is the information that we receive from the voters that they would like to see an increase in wind taxes. Wyoming Education Association would like our state to find a stable way to fund education so that every year when April and May come, the teachers worry about their jobs, they worry about their homes, they worry about how they're going to pay the bills until the legislature decides how we're going to fund education for the next year. The last 2 years have been very difficult for the teachers in this state, and we've seen teachers leave. We've seen very good teachers leave, and that impacts our classrooms, and that impacts our outcomes. And I know none of us want to see that happen, so we're here to work with you to find a solution. And we believe that stable funding through taxation we saw it in the last 4 slides that the gentleman just presented. Stable taxes provide a stable revenue source.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
So again, is it the official position of the WEA to raise taxes on wind, and if so, by how much?
Chairman Peterson, Senator Ellis, I think I've stated the position of WEA that we would like to see stable taxes. The voters in the state said they would like to see an increase in wind energy taxes. We are in favor of a diverse way of taxing the state, not just one industry. We've done that for years, and we can see that it's not working.
Further questions for Tammy? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Miller, come on up. Good to have you here. Thanks for having us.
Welcome to Riverton, but I'm speaking as an economic geologist, my profession. Basically, and Cale's heard me, for the last 15 years talk about this, and a few others have heard the same thing. But, your job and the legislature's job, and frankly the state's job, it's clear as a bell that if you want to diversify the tax base, we need a state income tax. Okay? I, for one, do not advocate a state income tax. I enjoy the mineral industry paying all the bills. And frankly, there are many, many other minerals that aren't being produced out there that we're not doing anything to encourage. I don't know why not. For a number of years, I've tried to get the governor to send Wyoming reps to the largest mining conference in the world to promote Wyoming minerals. And he sent one person 1 year. And the guy was blown away by what we're missing out on promoting Wyoming. Lithium, I believe the UW came out with a study a couple of years ago that Wyoming had $400 billion worth of lithium. What's that at a 7% severance tax and tax revenue? Tell me that. Again, what got me in the legislature, nearly 20 years ago was a report I co-authored, and it was titled Economic Diversification Through Mineral Resources. And it's all about the deposits that aren't being mined in Wyoming. Frankly, again, you want to diversify the economy, and I've told this straight to the governor, is all this other stuff that's going on, unless you do a state income tax and tax everyone else that's not paying bills, it's a recipe for disaster. We're going to lose money on everything we subsidize. Chairman Madden and I have had this conversation many times also. 10 years ago, we had a study on nuclear power, a nuclear energy task force. And at that time, the proposal was this encouraged nuclear power to come into Wyoming, and this put a 1 cent a kilowatt hour tax on any power that's exported out of Wyoming. What's that, Cale? $10 a megawatt hour? That would solve a lot of problems. Maybe the same thing with wind right now. I think Cale is on the right track, and Chairman Madden on the wind. I hate taxing anyone, but all that power is going out of state for other people's needs. So, that's one thing I might be able to support. But, think about the other minerals that aren't being produced in Wyoming. Look at the rare earth deposit that we've even funded studies on that didn't get going because the federal regulations delayed that to the extent they couldn't get going. There's many, many other opportunities like that in Wyoming. Again, the solution is a state income tax, but that's something I'm not advocating for.
Thank you. Representative, any questions for Representative Miller from the committee? We do know that you can tax something to death, and we're cautious about that in Wyoming. And I was, as we talk about the wind energy and the projects online right now, if I was an investor in that particular project and the legislature again started talking about a wind tax, and I was somewhat committed to that project, and all of a sudden the game changed, and it was real dollars, and all of a sudden all the feasibility studies are thrown out the window, and now it's not that profitable anymore, and so I pulled the plug on the wind project. That can happen, and so that's the game that we play. That's the battle that we face, and we balance that with what we heard today. So we walk that fine line. My next question to the committee, and we need to think about this, is Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Miller, I do have a question for you.
Come on back up, Representative.
On the economic development, as you've described it, is the idea of let's invite these companies in, pay their way, and it's a losing proposition that we do that. But not all of our economic development is invited. Some has been imposed upon us. Even here in your community, I see some types of stores that just kind of came here. And we have a lot of that in that state, in our state. In the last 40 years that I've been an observer, I've seen a big economy that just came to us, and we're faced with dealing with all the education, infrastructure, and all the other things to support these businesses, of which we don't have any taxable interest. And I was wondering if you would address that type of economic growth that we didn't really ask for necessarily.
Representative Miller.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermuller, I pretty much support anything. I want any types of jobs coming into the community. So, I realize what pays taxes and what doesn't. And for 15 years, I've tracked tax dollars created per job. And I asked some of the wind power people to do that, and it's actually a big number that wind power generates. And Mr. Chairman, on your comments just now, one thing I don't want to do either is once we attract someone to come to Wyoming based on some certain tax structure, I don't want to change the game once they get here and tax them more. And, what are we doing with the sportsmen's manufacturing groups? Are we somehow going to start sticking an income tax on them now? Would they have come here if they had known they had a state income tax? I don't know. But again, changing the rules after the fact, after we've attracted a particular business, a call center or a distribution center or whatever, I don't think that's fair either. Now, you have ready and willing people willing to pay taxes in Wyoming, but we have not only a state infrastructure, a state regulatory climate, but a federal regulatory climate that discourages that. And, modern mineral extraction, we're all familiar with oil and gas and coal and trona, but there's other minerals out there, the rare earths, there's several gold projects. These are all small footprint industries that employ 400 or 500 people that pay $50 million in taxes per year for the 500 employees. So, it's kind of makes a lot of sense. Nevada's doing it. Canada is still doing it. The developing countries around the world, this is what they do. They go after mineral extraction industries because number one, it's good jobs, and number two, it produces tax revenue. So, I've gone on enough.
Thank you. Further questions? No follow-up? Okay. Thank you, Representative Miller. Anybody else? Come on up, Representative Schwartz. Welcome.
Mr. Co-Chairman. Representative Andy Schwartz, House District 23. I had to stop and think.
Are we in your district?
We consider the whole state my district. It's hard to sit in a committee hearing. I'm used to being on that side where I can ask questions in the course of the conversation. And the question I've had in my head throughout this, he showed a graph the graphs comparing us to other states, Utah, Kentucky, I forget. He didn't necessarily distinguish what the tax structure differences were. I'm fairly certain he could do that for us. But what I'm curious about, and it kind of comes back to Senator Case's efforts over the years to increase the taxes on wind. And I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I think the information we need is when we change our tax structure in relationship to certain industries or even a personal income tax, can we calculate what the economic impact of that's going to be? Because with wind, for instance, if we raise the tax on wind and that makes us a less desirable state to put the turbines in because compared to other states we'll have a higher tax, how will that impact going down the road in terms of jobs and revenues? I don't know. But I think in conjunction with the report we got today, that would be valuable information.
Senator Case.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, you might not be aware of this, but we actually, the state of Wyoming, bought and built a model of how Wyoming compares with all the other states where wind could be established in the western grid. So there's lots of states with good wind, but in the western grid, we're the only one with good wind. And power doesn't move across to the other grids. So North Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, they're not our competitors. Our competitors are all from Wyoming's eastern border to the west. And in that area, there are several startling facts. One is that we have the very best wind by far, so that a turbine that's built in Wyoming is going to run many, many days more per year than anywhere else. And that turbine, with all that capital intensity that the good chairman talked about, is very capable of making a lot more money, which makes it very capable of paying a lot more taxes. The other thing is that in all those western states that are in the western grid, only Wyoming and Nevada don't have a corporate income tax on those wind profits. And Nevada is not a very good place to locate wind, unfortunately. Wyoming is the best. And it's because of the South Pass, that magnificent apex where there's a break in the Rocky Mountains. So if you draw a line from the South Pass north of Casper all the way into the Powder River Basin, and you draw that same line from the South Pass down below Cheyenne, that's the best wind in the western grid in spades. And our property taxes are very modest. Our sales taxes are very modest. This is the best place for them to come. And here's what happened to that model we built that showed all this. We went to try to resurrect that model last spring, and we learned from the company that built that model that the rights to that model for new work by the company have been purchased by a Wyoming wind developer. Now you tell me that that's fair, that a model that we paid for is out of our control. There's a public domain version, but the developer will not do that. So there is so much room to analyze this, and we should not make assumptions that if we raise it by a penny or 2 pennies or 5 that they're going to go away, because they simply will not. Don't you agree?
May I, Mr. Chairman?
Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Senator. I don't really have a comment. Clearly, you have significantly more information on this subject, but you actually highlight the point I'm trying to make, that we need to do that kind of analysis, not just on a wind tax, but on whatever we're going to consider. If we're even going to consider changing our tax structure, what will the economic impacts be? Because I think we're operating kind of in a vacuum with the information. Not to pick on Representative Miller, but he talks about it's unfair to change the rules because if we've attracted a business to the state, how could we possibly change the tax structure? My supposition is these are pretty savvy businessmen who probably recognize the fact that we do have an unsustainable tax structure, and that was part of their calculation. And I would say in general, our favorable tax structure, it's not as though we have businesses rushing into Wyoming because of that tax structure. We get some, but that's clearly not the only driver in what moves businesses, and we just don't have enough information. That was my only point. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it? Thank you. Anybody else from the public like to testify on this subject? We've just about beat it to death. So I guess my question then, I will close public comment. My question then, committee, is where do you want to go with this information? I've always said that I think our biggest challenge is educating the public because it's going to be them that have the final say on how this turns out. And I don't know if I believe completely the survey of everybody in Wyoming wants to pay more in taxes to pay for education. 60%. I don't know what the figure was, Tammy, but I think it'd be more fair question in how much more would you be willing to pay? $1,000 a year? $2,000 a year? $500 a year? That would be a more fair question because now you put it right squarely on them. Everybody wants to impose taxes on wind. Everybody wants to impose taxes on somebody else. But how much is it going to affect my pocketbook? If it's going to be $1,000 a year, now am I ready to jump through that hoop? I don't know. That's the question that should be asked on that survey. And if you send that survey out again, I'd urge you to reword that to get some better results. What's that? Did you categorize the amounts? And 60% we're willing to pay? Yeah, come on up here and give us a better understanding of your survey because.
Sure. So one of the questions we asked, let's see if I can bring the question, how much would you be willing to increase your taxes per year if those funds were solely dedicated to kindergarten through 12th grade public education here in Wyoming? And we gave them $4 amounts. $200 or more, 32% said yes. $150, 10% said yes. $100, 15% said yes. And $50 or less, 21% said yes. Now, we didn't go $1,000, which is probably more likely in a year, when you think about the money that we need to infuse into education to make it sustainable. But we did ask that question, so it'll be in the survey that I send to you.
Thank you. So anyway, get back to my question of
Mr. Chairman, can she repeat that? She went through it fast on the high end.
Back up here, Tammy.
200 or more.
You get it?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So on the high end, it was $200 or more. Was the high range of the question, and then it was $150, $100, and then 50 or less.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Okay.
Let me just take a picture.
So again, committee, my question is what's the committee's wishes on this particular? What's our responsibility? What's our game plan? What's our thoughts on this? Do we just leave it? I think the points that we've made so far is SLIB. Anybody that disperses money for the state ought to have this presentation. Maybe we can fine tune it and make it more of a quick little presentation. I don't know, but I think it's critical. I don't know how the role of this body ensures that happens or provides that to happen. Or Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First a question, and I think that maybe this is to LSO. I'm curious about what our contract is, perhaps, with Remy or Dr. Evangelikis, if I didn't butcher your name. Can we get answers to some of the other questions that were posed for further information? And then, Mr. Chair, to remind you, I think at one of the last meetings or last year, you talked about producing a brochure with some of this kind of information in it. You know, basically an 8.5 by 11 folded over that we could use and distribute it around the state. And I think that that's a possibility as well, that we should go back to that.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? I see microphone lights on, but nobody looking at it. Representative Obermuller.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on Representative Connolly's comment about, I'm curious too about what the contract and relationship is. I would really like to have the follow-up on the question I raised about the trade deficits that they seem to know something about, and other questions that Representative Connolly had. So I would like to see a follow-up, a presentation on that, but I don't know myself what the contractual relationship is. So thank you.
Have we spent all of our money, Doctor? Come on up.
Chairman, Representative. So right now, I believe the Economic Analysis Division has one of our tax models, the one that we use today, as well as a PI plus model, kind of a more basic model. I believe the tax PI model right now is the 70 sector, as I mentioned. So the 160 sector has a little bit more detail, and we've discussed a little bit about whether or not they want to move back to, because that's a model that they had, that the EAD had before, the 160, and then they've scaled back. We've discussed going back, and we can, we'd be happy to help the Economic Analysis Division work on some of these follow-ups. I think it'd be fruitful. We'd be happy to help them work through those analyses for you.
So we all look at Matt and our economic analysis group, our division. Is that a possibility to get the answers to those questions that we had today that would, I think, improve the presentation and get those questions clarified? And your thoughts, Matt? Timeline and...
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the Economic Analysis Division has the contract, so LSO has nothing to really do with that. I kind of stepped in because, I don't know if many of you know, Alex Keene has left the Economic Analysis Division, is now at the University of Wyoming. So I can work with Wen Lin Liu and Jim Robinson, and then maybe whoever the new head of the Economic Analysis Division is. I don't know the details on those contracts between EAD and REMI, but I think LSO would be happy to work with them in some kind of brochure type format and further runs and analysis of this. I think, I've got Peter's email as well, so we can work on that.
I wasn't aware of Alex leaving, but you're our go-to guy. You're our link between the economic analysis folks and this committee. So,
sure, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to work with them.
Okay.
And we have in the past. So
thank you. Anything else on this subject for this committee? Representative Kinner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of those that I guess we talked about briefly, but one that would be very interesting, and I believe Representative Obermuller brought it up, would be the 100 jobs in the retail area. Say we have a new store that begins with W come into your community, and what is the impact of that? And so that might be very, very interesting along those same lines. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, if there's no further discussion, then committee, I think we'll keep this on the table, and Matt will work with Economic Analysis Group and have some further comments on next meeting. But keep this in mind as we talk about, we don't, at least as my part as co-chairman of this committee, and we're losing our other co-chairman, but I don't want this to be another tax reform 2000 and nothing's done. I don't care if it's even just a baby step. I don't care if it's a lodging and tax presentation and it passes, we need to do something. And anything in that direction of diversifying our tax base or our tax revenue stream, I think would be a great thing for this committee to accomplish. And so keep that in mind. Did I see another hand somewhere? Oh, there it was.
Mr. Chairman, an announcement. Some committee members asked about a possible tour of the golf course in and could I get a show of hands of anyone that's interested in taking a tour?
When was that going to be?
We could do it upon adjournment tomorrow. I'm assuming that would be me.
Should be, yep.
Okay, so 4 or so, 5, okay. That's all I needed.
Okay.
And with just one question, do you want to have lunch before you go on the tour? Or do you want to do it? Do the tour first and then have lunch? Yeah. Are you buying? No.
You might have a better show of hands if you're buying.
Hey, it's not my tour. Anyway, it'll be somewhere around noon or 12:30, so I'll make.
Okay, thank you. All right. We're ready to move on. 3:30 and we're right on task. Number 7, local tax options, continuation from 2017 interim study. Well, we take a break, we're going to get behind. Okay, 5-minute break. Let's go 10 minutes. 20 till.
We had a discussion a couple, 3 weeks ago about a serious issue.
Try to get out of here at a decent hour. We sure do. Got a lot of business to cover. Mr. Co-Chairman, you want to make a statement here?
Just a short statement, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. When we met at Management Council, Senator Peterson and I, this was not one of our highest priorities, okay? And the debate turned into one, why not? How come it isn't a high priority? And so they moved it up to, I think it's our second priority now. I don't have the actual list of our topics, but their intent here is that we're supposed to get serious about this, and their idea is that this 105 million is not a sustainable number. And so whether we're looking at new revenues, new options of revenue for local governments, or some combination of shifting revenue from one area to another, they want to see some progress made in reducing, if not eliminating, that 105 million every 2 years. So with that prelude, I'll turn it back over and we'll listen to it.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Who's going to present this? Not the department. Dean? Somebody? We have a bill.
There's a number of bills that, and these are just old rehashed bills that you can look at. One of them is a bill by Representative Schwartz that we have here. It's a real estate transfer tax. And that, doesn't work for every county, but it may work for some counties. Then we have the other one, I think, that was worked on by, this is a 2018 bill, and I think it didn't make it on a split vote. And I think that we can probably, this is one that's called 18 LSO 0287. And that one does have some potential. And I think that maybe rather than to go through the local tax options, we should hear from any hearing the updates from the County Commission Association and the WAM, Wyoming Association of Municipalities, if they have anything to present, and then we'll talk about whether any of the bills that we've got here in our file are appropriate to pursue, or if there's other ideas, because I think there are other ideas. So go ahead.
I had an email from WHAM, and they said they couldn't be here to this meeting. Really? Is there anybody from WHAM here? Or? I think okay.
Mr. Chairman, you do have in your packet this presentation that Mr. Kaysen provided us, and at the end of it, he provided his talking points in written form, but he was unable to make it today.
Okay. Let's take these in the order that they're on our agenda. Local option tax municipalities. We wanted to look at that brochure or presentation from Mr. Kaysen, and if the mayor would like to come up and speak on that presentation. Are you familiar with this that Mr. Kaysen sent us? About that much? Why don't you come up and just kind of highlight it for us, and we can look at it and kind of update us on what we're doing here and what the WHAM proposal is. And does he have a copy of this?
I do not.
Maybe we can get him a copy. Yep, here it comes. Here it comes.
So, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I told Mr. Kaysen that I would attend the meeting, but I didn't expected I would be presenting. But the concern, of course, is that if the legislature is looking at doing away with the 105 million direct distribution, that somehow communities need some way to fund operations. So that's a fairly simple ask.
Okay. So this is important for our towns and counties. If that 105 million does go away, as is mentioned by my co-chairman, being unsustainable in our fiscal situation, then we need to do something to help the towns and counties make up that difference. And local optional taxes is certainly one way. Anything else that you'd like to add, Mayor? Appreciate you inviting us to your town here and hosting us.
We're grateful that you came, Chairman. So that as you go through this publication, you can see that there's a couple of things that WHAM has identified. The first one is has to do with
I was looking on page 16.
Yeah, on page 16.
There's 4 items there that
continue direct distribution, possibility increase the cap for severance and mineral royalties. That was set, a number of years ago, and no adjustment's been made to deal with inflation. There's some maybe additional sales tax that would be shared with communities in some way. I don't know that we've got a perfect solution to suggest. When you look at you look at the municipal sales tax option, to me that is a concern. I mean, Pavilion out here, with a population of less than 100 people and no store, you see, they could pass the sales tax inside their city limit, but it wouldn't generate anything for them.
Yeah.
Okay, for us here in Riverton, if the people of Riverton would pass that, then it would roughly replace the direct distribution that we currently get.
Okay. Any questions for the mayor? Everybody's had a chance to look over this proposal, especially on page 16. That's kind of a synopsis of what WHAM's suggestions or some different alternatives might be as we talk about the local taxing options. Mr. Co-Chairman?
I guess the only thing I would add here, Mr. Co-Chair, is that the bill, the local tax option bill that I referred to a little bit ago in 2018, that didn't go to the general or the budget session, is at 287, and that kind of conforms to page 20. And we had some testimony. We'll probably hear it again today, but I think that if we're trying to really be serious about this, we'd have to do 2 things. We'd have to say, look, if almost every other state has a municipal option, okay? And I think I questioned the argument that we got the last time we talked about this. Was people from the county commission said, well, we might have to pay this tax, but we don't get to vote on it. And that's not really I don't buy that reasoning anymore. I think that had too much influence when we talked about it back in last fall. I don't do it very often, but I live in Johnson County, but sometimes I end up having to go to Sheridan County, and I would feel like I would be pretty pompous if I'd say, well, I didn't have to vote or didn't get a chance to vote on your Sheridan tax, and here I am having to pay it. And, you know, if you, that's a choice you have as a consumer to do that. The other thing is, you know, to be realistic, as the mayor here said, these small towns, no matter what you do with that, local option tax isn't going to help them, which leads me to believe that we'll never we'll never remove that $105 million down to $0. There's always going to be, you know, if we're going to maintain this goal in the state that little towns need to sustain themselves, and there's no such thing as a stranded asset, we're going to have to continue paying for those because they have no tax base. They have no sales tax base. They have no property tax base. There's no way to tax anybody. So with that, you know, I guess we can talk about, you know, maybe we ought to hear from the counties first, and then we'll talk about what options we want to look at.
Well, there's the second item on our little list on the agenda is the status of cities and towns, and that's again by Wham. I don't know what Mr. Kaysen was going to cover there with that particular subject, but I think it's been pointed out that smaller towns have very little capability of even raising a sales tax, and it wouldn't generate anything. So, but the status of cities and towns, did anything to add to that, Mayor, or that subject, that second item on our agenda?
Yeah, he did not brief me on what his presentation was going to look like. And I just got the same email that you did that said that he was not going to be able to make the meeting. So I said I'd come and take notes.
I'm sure it was all doom and gloom as far as cash reserves, and everybody seems to be hurting out there. So with that, then we'll move on to the counties. Come on up here, Pete, and introduce yourself. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Pete Obermueller, Executive Director of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. Appreciate the opportunity. Mr. Chairman, a little bit of it is, I mean, the topic is kind of a reprise from last year, and so my presentation is a little bit of a reprise with some updated information. The big difference, Mr. Chairman, is this year we have a little bit better direction in terms of what you're trying to do with regard to the $105 million, which is, as the Management Council directed, to reduce or eliminate it. I do have specific suggestions on how you could do that, in fact. And I think, depending on what you do, you could get it to zero, either immediately or over a glide path over time. But before I get to that, Mr. Chairman, I think you have in your packets this little presentation here. There's a few extras in the back as well. I just want to run through it really quickly and then answer any questions. Mr. Chairman, the first page there is intergovernmental funding. It's a 4-year trend. What I mean by intergovernmental funding, Mr. Chairman, is the major sources of revenue that the state shares with us. So it's not, you'll see when we get to the future pages, it's not an exhaustive list of local revenue. There are some things that I left out. It would be a hard to read pie chart if we added everything, cigarette tax and parimutuel and et cetera, but these are the major sources, ones that we really rely on year over year for our operations. So on there you'd see the top red line is property tax collected. Blue is intergovernmental funding, which I do define as sales and use, the capped severance tax, the direct distribution, and then all the gas taxes we get. Those are our major sources of revenue. That's what I'm measuring there on the total intergovernmental funding from the state. That also included, Mr. Chairman, the consensus block grant program, which was a program that went to local governments for us to reach consensus between the counties and the cities on infrastructure projects. That was eliminated. In fact, that was eliminated a few years ago, and that was a major hit to our funding. And then finally, the federal funding is, of course, the payment in lieu of taxes, the PILT program, and then secure rural schools. I don't have the data right now, but PILT actually was received in the omnibus bill, its largest appropriation in history, and so the counties receiving PILT money, that number there for FY18 will be larger than 30 million. There's no doubt about that. I'm going to come back to PILT later because my suggestion on dealing with the 105 actually follows a PILT model, and I'll get back to that. So, Mr. Chairman, on page what's labeled 3 of 11 there, and then also 4 of 11. 3 of 11 is our state intergovernmental funding, but I added in property tax. Property tax is, of course, constitutional. Counties are capped at 12 mills. These numbers are specific county revenue for FY18. Some of it's a little bit estimated. Obviously, we still have a month left in FY18. I wanted to point this out, Mr. Chairman, because when you're talking about trying to eliminate or replace the direct distribution, you can see on the right there that that direct distribution slice of the pie at 18.462 million. That's an annual direct distribution funding for the counties. It doesn't include cities and towns. That's the county funding. If you want to eliminate that and remove that pie, you have very limited options on where to find that revenue. One of your options, of course, is just to eliminate that slice and shrink the pie. I would hope that that wouldn't be the course you would take. And to the chairman's point that maybe there was outsized influence, I think it's probably just the right amount of influence. But the point is that you have cap severance, that's the tiny one, diesel, gas, and county road construction fund. Those are both constitutionally and statutorily limited to roads. So we can't carve that out. You could carve that out, I suppose, in some way, but there'd be a constitutional problem with spending that money on anything but roads and road maintenance. So that leaves you with sales and use tax and property tax. And there's all sorts of other little things that you could theoretically do to cobble it together, and I'll get to that later. But the biggest sources of revenue where you could help us recover that slice is on sales and use and property tax. So if you turn to page 4, Mr. Chairman, I cut out the property tax. In terms of dealing with increased revenue for counties, property tax is difficult. First, we're constitutionally capped at 12 mills, so you're not going to increase the mills. You could increase the assessment ratio, and that would affect us. I'll get to that later. But property tax is more difficult. So if you take out property tax, then you're left with really with quite a bit less sales and use and cap severance. Keep in mind, Mr. Chairman, that when it comes to sales and use tax generally favors the cities and towns, and they receive about 2/3 of sales and use tax, and counties receive about 1/3. So, Mr. Chairman, if you turn to page 5 and then also 6, this is a breakdown again of the state intergovernmental funding. So this is sales and use, all those ones from before, broken out by county. The orange bar is FY15, the blue bar is FY18. Obviously, you can see that it has gone down for every county except for Hot Springs and Niobrara. They're at the very far right in terms of intergovernmental funding. I bring this up, Mr. Chairman, because this one and the next one in particular really help to illustrate what the goal of the direct distribution from the legislature is. It's not just supplemental income for local governments. That certainly is the primary goal. But part of it is that this is your discretionary money that you have decided to send to local governments in order to help sort of squeeze down this distribution from left to right in terms of what large, particularly mineral-rich counties can earn versus other counties that are agriculture-based or don't have population or property tax ability. That becomes increasingly clear on page 6 of 11 when you look at it at a per capita. From a per capita standpoint. You can see in FY15, Sublette County was way up there in a per capita. They shrunk significantly. Now, a lot of that, of course, was the shrink in sales and use tax, but a big part of that change was the adoption of the new funding distribution model that we affectionately call the Madden matrix, which really did squeeze the upper end and lift the bottom end. One interesting thing I've found about this particular chart is some of you have been around for the long-standing battle between the current Speaker of the House and the former President of the Senate about which county was getting the worst end of the deal when it came to the distribution formula. Turns out they're both kind of right on a per capita basis. It's pretty bad for both of those counties, quite frankly. So, Mr. Chairman, moving on to the next two, this is the first one is intergovernmental funding, and the next one is property tax. You can look at them at their leisure. Part of the issue that we face in local government funding, of course, is the disparity of funding between both intergovernmental funding and also property tax. So what I've done here is divided the counties into 3 tiers: the top 7 counties, the second 7 counties, and then the bottom 9 counties, and calculated the total intergovernmental funding, state intergovernmental funding between those tiers, and also the property tax. And you can see that the disparity is large. The bottom counties share only 17% of the revenues compared to the top tier, which is sharing 58% on state intergovernmental funding. That includes the money from direct distribution. Property tax is even more stark, Mr. Chairman, 29% shared by the bottom 14 counties. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to pause there before I get into the recommendations or possible options. I guess they're not really recommendations, in case anyone has questions about those, that data or those revenue sources or anything like that.
Any questions for Mr. Obermuller? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just one question. I'm trying to remember the last year that we had consensus money. Is part of the reason that those bars on page 5 and 6, or 5, let's say, is that bar been changed because the consensus is no longer in the blue bar, or didn't we have consensus in fiscal year 15?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Co-Chairman Madden. Yes, actually on the first page, 2 of 11, the FY15 blue line that's up there at 188 million, that includes consensus, and then drops down to 135. Which was a loss of consensus plus a loss of during the economic loss.
Further questions? All right, continue on.
So, Mr. Chairman, when our members in our revenue committee were taking a look at what we would want, first of all, we really appreciate that the discussion has gone towards how do we figure out how to reduce or eliminate the 105. That's the right discussion. And at least in my time, it's the first time it's been that discussion, instead of just how do we eliminate it and you fend for yourselves. That's been the discussion before that we've had to fight. Now it's how can we actually replace it? The italics on page 9 of 11 is, of course, the Management Council directive. How do we figure out how to make it self-sustaining, reduce or eliminate supplemental state support in direct local government funding? So for us, in order to do that and have us be supportive, I mean, you can do it in a lot of ways, but in order for us to be supportive, of course, there's sort of 4 criteria. One, it must be a replacement, and the important thing to talk about there is sort of two points. One, making permanent a tax that is currently levied is not a replacement. So one of the options that was on the table in previous years was just to make the 5th cent tax permanent. Well, the 5th cent we already have the 5th cent, so that doesn't replace if you take away the direct distribution. But more importantly, there is a distinction, and I've said this before, between local option taxes and voter option taxes. Providing new or expanded voter option taxes is not a replacement. It's a hope, and would certainly fight for that hope to the extent that we're actually legally allowed to even advocate for that. But it is not a replacement of the 105. That second criteria is that it must, to the extent it can, minimize further tiering. That's the tiering of the previous 2 pages that I pointed out. As I mentioned, the point of direct distributions was to try to help deal with that tax revenue that is directed, 70% directed to the top 77 counties. So if all you do is increase the sales tax, or all you do is increase the property tax ratio without doing anything else, the effect of that is to exacerbate the tiering. Third is to minimize the incentive for voter rejection of local option taxes. This is a tough one. Who knows where this line is at, quite frankly. Where is the sensitivity level among voters in terms of continuing to vote for the 5th or the 6th or the ever elusive 7th? we don't know where that is, but I think it can be minimized. So I'll get to that in a second. And then finally, maintain the balance between cities, towns, and counties. What I mean by that is the current 105 million is distributed. It's been distributed in the same way now for many, many years. We and the cities have not argued over that distribution for many, many years, and we think it's fair and that it generally should be the same. That is to say that counties get about 34, 35%. Somebody can check me on my math, and the cities get the rest of that 105. So, Mr. Chairman, I should point out, I think now when we're talking about those criteria, you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the municipal-only tax option, and that the issue was that folks didn't have the ability to vote. That certainly was one argument, and I think reasonable people can disagree on the merits of that argument. But that wasn't the main argument. The main argument was that municipal-only taxes voted on and imposed only in the cities will necessarily, over time, congregate all of the revenue into the major metropolitan areas of the state. There's no other way around it if you just do municipal-only taxes. You have to sort of game it out. If the city of Cheyenne votes itself its own tax, regardless of whether the county had a right to vote for it or not, then the next time a county-wide comes up for election, all the residents of Cheyenne will say, we've already taken care of ourselves. We voted ourselves our own tax. Why would we vote ourselves another tax for everybody else? Or conversely, you could say, well, let's just say that the county and the small towns vote for their 1% and we leave the cities where they are. Well, we could do that, but collectively the counties and the small towns won't raise the kind of revenue that's raised when we have the bigger cities. So either way, it leaves a municipal only leaves out the counties and the small cities and towns. I don't see any other way around it. It's not to say there's not a solution. I just don't think that's the solution. We might be able to get there with a little bit more thought. So moving on to the actual point of replacing the 105. And keep in mind that the municipal-only tax isn't actually a replacement anyway. It's a voter option, again, which doesn't meet our first criteria. So anyway, moving on to possible avenues to reduce or eliminate. So I'm going to lay out a few bullet points about what's possible and then make a suggestion. So currently, there's a typo here on that first, on the second bullet point there. The state share, you could increase the share of state sales and use tax that's distributed to the counties and the cities and towns. So currently, the state gets a little more than 69%, and the locals get a little less than 31%. There's 30 written on your sheet there. That should say 31. I get all exercised over the 1% administrative holdback, and so I messed up that number. Sorry about that. A 3 percentage point increase to a true 34%. What I mean by a true 34% is get rid of this sort of silly 1% administrative holdback that the state keeps. So it's actually 34% for locals. Would net approximately $61 million for the biennium. For the counties themselves, about $21 million for a biennium. So this, as I mentioned, that favors cities over counties, favors counties with high sales tax revenue over other counties. That sort of thing reduces the state general fund revenue without other offsets for the state. The benefit, of course, is it doesn't raise any taxes. It's just a redirection of current revenue. You could increase the assessment ratio for residential and industrial properties. We've looked at this before. A 1% increase nets about $28 million for counties for the biennium. That favors counties over cities and high property tax counties over others. The benefit of that is it also raises revenues for schools and the state in addition to reducing direct distribution, so it's a sort of double benefit, but of course it raises taxes. You could increase the statewide sales tax by a 0.5 percentage point. Again, that's approximately $46 million for counties if it's distributed entirely to locals, or about $14 million if the current split remains in place, 69-31. Increasing this begins to jeopardize voter option taxes, and which, if we lose the voter options, those would hurt us more than a 0.5 cent increase would help. I know that Representative Schwartz will talk about some others, but there is the possibility of having new local options that only if passed would offset an approved direct distribution amount. So the real estate transfer tax, there are others that could be in there, but I know the real estate transfer tax is on the agenda, so that's there. Increase the under the cap severance distribution. The cities have talked about raising the severance cap. The severance cap is $155 million. All right, so the first $155 million of severance is distributed in multiple ways. Counties currently receive 3.88% of that $155 million. If you increase that to 6%, the cities have talked about raising the cap, and so increasing the revenue to all of those sources. What I'm suggesting here is you just raise the amount to counties. You could do it to cities and towns too, but I'm just talking about counties here. So that finally gets to sort of what my recommendation is, that none of those by themselves really work, but a small combination of some or all of these could work. For counties alone, you need about $38 million over the biennium to remove counties from direct distribution. So if you were to increase the sales and use local ratio to 34%, increase the assessment ratio by 0.25%, increase the statewide sales tax by 0.25% with the traditional split, and increase the severance distribution to 5%. That creates about $37 million for counties over the biennium, and we'd be out of the business of asking you for an additional supplemental. I should point out, and I pointed out before, there are other sources that you could attack in the same way and cobble together a lot of small sources to make this happen. These are the biggest sources of money. So when we start talking about the smaller ones, cigarette tax, the Wyoming lottery, some of the other things, we'd have to have a lot longer list to get to the $37 million. Keep in mind that that is, of course, just counties. You have cities to deal with as well. So, Mr. Chairman, getting back to how do we deal with the tiering problem? There's two approaches. There's the carve-out approach. The benefit of the carve-out approach is, to the chairman's point, you can actually zero out the $105 million if you take the steps like the small combinations and then you carve out $105 million off the top and distribute it via the Madden matrix. You have eliminated the 105, and you've kept everybody whole in terms of the revenue they're receiving. It's a little bit complicated, and the problem for us is that starts to encroach upon a long-standing agreement among the locals, at least, that revenue generated locally should stay local rather than being redistributed a la school recapture. So that gets me finally, Mr. Chairman, to PILT, and thank you for entertaining me for this long committee. Payment in lieu of taxes is paid by the federal government each year that it is authorized and appropriated, first by calculating what each county in the nation is eligible to receive, and then that amount is reduced by dollar for dollar for the amount of revenue or distributions from the federal government and other programs, including SRS and Bankhead Jones and some of the other ones. So your total bill payment ends up being less than what you're eligible for. That could be a model that we follow here too. That if you took those little steps and you still passed the 105 in order to protect the smaller counties, you could analyze what that new revenue, it would be easy to figure out what that new revenue brought into each county and city and town over the year and reduce dollar for dollar from your direct distribution what that new revenue generated. So it's a little bit difficult to forecast, particularly as it relates to property tax. It's very difficult to forecast property tax, so that's not here. But this gives you a little bit of a sense of how that would look. So I'll pick a county, let's say Laramie County there, about halfway down. The current severance tax, and then the next column is the new severance if it was at 5%. The difference is an additional $282,000 for the county. Move across, of course, a new sales tax split would bring in $1.4 million for Laramie County. And a new sales tax revenue at 4.25%, $581,000 for Laramie County. The total net increase of that, not including if you did a property tax, is $2.3 million for Laramie. What they expect in their direct distribution from the legislature is $2.17 million. In other words, the new revenue outstrips what they would receive in direct distribution, so they would receive none in direct distribution. That provides a county or a city that can build and maintain and sustain its own revenue, the ability to do that, while protecting a county like, for instance, Hot Springs, that you can see all that net increase would only net them about $98,000. So their direct distribution still is relatively high. Again, property tax isn't estimated here because I can't do that. Mr. Chairman, that is my suggestion, or at least in terms of options that are available if you want to reduce and eliminate. The one problem, of course, as you'll note with the PILT approach, is that requires about $16 million in new revenue that only reduces the state obligation by about $10 million. It takes a lot longer to deal with these smaller counties that have difficulty raising revenue themselves. But it could serve as a glide path over time.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Obermuller? One down at the end. Representative Connolly.
Fair to say that what you're calling new sources of revenue, with the exception of the statewide sales tax increase by $0.25, is really just redistribution. Basically, what you're saying is instead of money going to the general fund or instead of money going elsewhere, really you're saying direct it to the locals. So it really isn't new sources of revenue.
Mr. Chairman. Not quite, Representative Connolly. I know what you're saying. Listed them separately. So if all you did was a change in the split, the 69-31%, and the severance tax change, that is just a redirection of state revenue. You're absolutely right. If you did that by itself. What I have suggested is you do that, and in addition, you have the small sales tax and the small property tax assessment, which if you combine the two, you've redirected some to the locals, yes, but you've made up for that with a revenue source that the state also enjoys. So you have your share of the quarter-cent sales tax. You have your share of a percentage point increase in the property tax assessment ratio. By your share, I mean the school share, quite frankly. But you make up for some of that reallocation with a new revenue source.
Mr. Chair, just to follow up.
Yep,
Representative
Connolly.
What's the percentage between basically redistributing existing revenue and those new increases?
Mr. Chairman, the percentage, I can't tell you, but I do have Mr. Chairman, I didn't put it on the sheet specifically, unfortunately, but I did in fact calculate out what the amount is of each one. So, for instance, on the split, if you assume that a county will receive, if you change it from 6931 to 3466, that is about 10.5 million per year for counties. That would be 10.5 million lost to you.
Mr. Chair, and that, just as a follow-up, that would be a 10.5 million loss to the general fund.
Right. So, and then, Mr. Chairman, so then if you did that by itself, it's a straight loss. If you ended up increasing let's say the sales tax ratio or the sales tax by a quarter cent, then I don't have the total here, but you're going to more than make up for that in your share of sales tax. Because I mean, you can see, if over a biennium, that would net 46 million for counties alone if all of it was given to the counties. But if you maintain the concurrent share, then counties only get 14 million. Right, so you can see, I don't have the numbers here. I can do the math and send it to you, but to figure it out dollar for dollar, whether or not it's totally a complete wash or not. But the attempt, I mean, I do recognize, of course, that just rearranging the deck chairs doesn't necessarily help the state so much. But at the end of the day, if you're going to do something other than just rearrange the deck chairs, you all have to make the decision to make some of these revenue increases, or just reduce the pie and direct distribution.
Thank you, and I'd like to see those figures.
Okay, further questions? Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Did you include the increase in the assessment ratio in your back chart? I guess it isn't a chart, but I don't know what you want to call this.
Page 11.
Page 11. There we go.
Mr. Chairman. No, Representative Larson, I didn't because I don't have the tools to calculate that in a way that would be that I could sit here and say were even reasonably accurate.
Follow up?
Yep, good.
Someone could get those tools, maybe like the assessors, you think, or something?
Mr. Chairman, well, Senator Wasserberger just said it's pretty simple. I'd be happy to take a lesson because I worked for a long time on it to try to figure out, because property taxes, first of all, is delayed a year. So what the numbers here were a projection of FY19, and we can't project FY19 for quite a while. And then if you just up the assessment ratio, that's different than just upping what the local assessment is. So I'm sure there's a way to do it. I just wasn't smart enough to figure it out.
For further discussion, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can we get those maybe for the next time?
Mr. Chairman, if I can find someone with the tools to do it, I'm happy to do it. It wasn't for a lack of trying.
Who would have that? Revenue? Would that be difficult to put together?
Mr. Chairman, they did it for the last interim, but for the state, not for the locals, and not for, I looked at all that data from last year. What the department did last year wasn't what we were talking about here. So it would require a different look.
Ms. Arnold?
So, Mr. Chairman, if there are no other questions, I had just a couple closing remarks real quick, if that's okay. I think it's important to point out that our position really hasn't changed from last year to this year. Last year's conversation at this committee was about raising revenue for revenue's sake at the state level. And our position was at that time, and the members are still this way today, that in terms of dealing with the county budget, my members aren't prepared to support broad statewide tax increases. Now, the calculus changed this year from your management council direction, which was reduce or eliminate the 105. Now, if you reduce or eliminate the 105, that changes our calculation. And so that's why we're making these suggestions. As my former boss used to say, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, so I wanted to point that out.
Okay. Any further questions before we excuse? Oh, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Okay, well, first, I appreciate your analysis here and your thoughts you went through here. And I'm looking on page 10, okay? And it's under the bullet that says small combinations of some or all of these. And I'm just wondering if we, let's say we did increase the percentage that goes to local governments to 34%, okay? And we also increased and didn't do anything with the assessment ratio, okay? Because that has it's a little different the way it works. It works in different ways for the county than it does the city and stuff like that. It's not just money.
Correct.
So anyway, but if we eliminate that, but we look at the increase of statewide sales tax by 0.5%, let's say, okay? And maybe just stop there and not get the severance tax distribution put in there. But I'm just thinking in my mind that if we did that, if we raised it and then raised the percent going to locals, the state may be almost held harmless by that. Or you could almost say, let's just, hold the state harmless and we'll give the rest of it to local governments and then see how much that is and then distribute it according, you call it the Madden matrix, but distribute it according to need, which is what the matrix does. But I wonder if how close that would get us to the 105. Just run the same formula that we're using now, but use new money by, number one, changing the state's ratio, and number two, changing the percentage amount by 0.5%. That arithmetic you could do tonight, couldn't you? Are you going to be here tomorrow?
Right. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be here tomorrow. And yeah, if you increase the statewide sales tax by 0.5%, that nets $14 million annually for the counties. So that by itself, with the change in the split, doesn't get us to it reduces the 105. It doesn't eliminate the 105. I should point that out.
Okay.
But Mr. Chairman, but your point is very valid in the sense that what I was trying to do here was be sensitive to a lot of different things. One, the criteria that obviously my association has set out, the needs of the city, quite frankly, but also the needs of the state, but also the needs of quite frankly, you individually. If you're going to have to deal with 105 by a tax increase, I'm not blind to what that means. So that's why the percentages are very, very small. And we can make them even smaller and work on packaging them together. There's really an infinite possibilities of cobbling together 105 million. And I'm happy to look at any of them, quite frankly. This was just a stab to get that ball rolling in your minds that 105 million, or at least as it relates to counties, 38 million. We can come up with 38 million, and we can make that hit widespread and small if we divide it up amongst a lot of different sources.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm just. I'll have to think about this tonight. I have nothing else to do tonight, but I'm just wondering if we increased it by 0.5%, that tells me that even if we gave away 34 instead of 30, the state probably is still better off, wouldn't it be?
It's possible, Mr. Chairman. I can do the math, but
another what if then would be how much of a percent could we increase in order to hold the state harmless, not make money for the state, although we could use it. But how much would that give both cities and counties if we did it that way? But I'll work on that. Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? None? Okay. We got one. Representative Kenner.
Well, it's really, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's really just a clarification because what we've been talking about here the last little bit just takes care of the counties. It doesn't take care of the city portion of that, right?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. My recommendation of those percentages, the 1/4 and all that stuff, that gets you $38 million, which takes care of the counties.
Right.
And remember, we only get about 35% of the direct distribution. So the rest of the problem I leave to my friends here and at the cities. But my suggestion is how to get the counties out of the business.
Right. And in a perfect world, we would have WAM and the counties here together singing Kumbaya and saying, here's our plan. Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. I hate to belabor this, but if you left the formula the same for cities versus counties, roughly 1/3, 2/3 type thing, the implication would be that the 37 million for the counties would translate into about 60 or 70 million for the cities, right? Yeah.
That's
So
correct,
we're-
but
we're
not
right.
from my estimate, not from my revenue estimates in this document, Mr. Chairman. I did the math on what those particular ratios would do, and that gets us to about 37, 38 million. You would have to
change the formula.
You would have to increase
Oh,
those
well.
percentages to deal with the cities.
Okay. Small chance of that, but
Okay. If no further questions, thank you, Pete.
Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is, the directive was to reduce or eliminate, so for whatever that's worth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, the last item on the agenda in this section was the real estate transfer tax. Somebody want to give us a recap of what the idea, concept was here, refresh our memory, and then we'll take public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, and thank you for indulging me again. You might recall, I believe it was in November, I presented the bill to this committee. I'll just briefly go through the structure of the bill. Basically, the way it's set up, it's a voter option. Mr. Obermuller, the younger, likes that distinction, I believe, as opposed to a local option. Has to be approved by the voters. The way this bill is structured, it would only apply to one county, and that's the county I represent, because there's a threshold that requires, in the current version, 650 million in real estate sales before a county would be eligible. Teton is the only county that reaches that level. Now, that's obviously, we can change that. That's just the way I structured the bill to make it simpler, because really what my intention is, we need to look at local option taxes or voter option taxes for the local governments, because I actually have a darker view of the future of funding for local governments, because it's not just about the 105 million. When we start talking about the sales tax split and we talk about raising local government's percentage, that's not the only thing we can do with the sales tax split. We could actually lower the local government percentage. And as time goes by, if other revenue streams don't increase for the state, and we're looking at funding K through 12 education and school maintenance and construction, I'm not sure what the legislature is going to do. But having been a county commissioner for 12 years, I can't get rid of that part of my brain. And I worry what's going to happen to local funding when the state starts trying to find these other revenue streams. The lottery is another good example, where currently a lot of funding goes to local governments. But that can change. So back to that's kind of the overall premise. And the other thing I would add, I don't know what other county revenue streams would look like. I have joked with Representative Connolly that in Albany County, an appropriate tax would be on beer and pizza, because that is what they sell. You get the idea. So back to this bill, it then sets up a structure where, depending on the value of the real estate, there's a different tax. So the first million, which in Teton County is workforce housing, the tax is only 0.01%, and that would go through any sale. So even a $10 million sale, the first million is taxed at 0.01%. And then it steps up. 1 million to 2 million, that second million would be taxed at 1%, and on, up to, I think, at 5 million, it goes to 2. The calculations are hard to make precisely what the return on it would be, because I don't have every sale. I got category scales for residential, but I say 3 million a year would be not an unreasonable estimate of what that could bring to Teton County. The way the bill is structured, that $3 million would be split between the town and the county according to population, the same way sales tax is. That's the essence of the bill. There's exemptions, there's ag exemptions, there's exemptions for interfamily transactions, a couple others. But I believe that's the essence. It was not introduced onto the floor. None of the tax bills in the House came to the floor. So we were unable to have that conversation in the last session. Were you still here? Of course she's still here. I know that the real estate industry will strongly object to this bill. I understand their objections. I guess my argument would be that what they want us to say, and I believe they actually would like to see a constitutional amendment that would say real estate transfer taxes cannot be done in Wyoming. It seems a little odd to me that we would single out a particular industry and say they cannot be taxed, because I would be willing to wager any amount of money that if we went to the coal industry and asked them if they would like to be included in that constitutional exemption, they would probably be more than willing to join in. I don't think that's going to happen, but I just don't understand why we constitutionally exempt a particular industry when we are actually, this committee is looking at the flaws in our current tax structure and how can we find new ways to create revenue streams for Wyoming so that we can deal with what we all, I think, many of us consider to be a flawed tax structure. Pete really, in terms of all the other stuff about local revenue, I can't state it any better than Pete did. So I'll just pause for questions.
Representative Hallinan. There you got it. You got it.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does Teton County need $3 million a year to operate?
Representative Schwartz.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I would say on this particular day, not necessarily, but a lot of their revenue streams are not guaranteed. For instance, to begin with, the money's coming from the state that we give to local governments. Pete mentioned the PILT. The PILT has been wildly inconsistent in terms of how they appropriate from Congress. Teton County is a huge recipient of that. There are other taxes, and the lodging tax, oddly, is a controversial issue in Teton County because there's a sense that it is increasing congestion in the summer months. A discussion of tourism in Teton County is rather complicated, and I can appreciate that the rest of the state might not quite understand it. I don't agree with that philosophy, but they want to see the lodging tax go away because they think it's unnecessarily promoting the county in the summer, even though the money is only spent for promotion in the shoulder seasons in the winter. So, but that tax right there brings in $2.5 million a year to the town and the county. So, and I could go on. There are other factors that could significantly impact the revenue streams there. So whether or not they need it today, probably not. Whether they will need it in the future, I would say it's highly likely.
Further questions for the representative? None? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else would like to speak on this? Anything from the LSO staff on this? Your name was after the title. Nothing? Okay. Public comment. Anybody like to testify on this particular subject? Come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. You're probably getting very hopeful that you wouldn't have to listen to me again. Sorry to disappoint. I want to touch on several of these topics. The first one is the last one that was discussed, the transfer tax. As a good representative said, that dollar amount of sales can be changed. Well, it can be moved up or it could be moved down, and so then other counties would be applicable. I also have concerns about the negative impact on the sales price. These things are bought and people can afford to pay so much. If a transfer tax is put on there, that lowers the dollar amount that for the property itself, because the tax will be part of the cost and go into the payment just like property taxes are. And so if that price goes down, what happens to property taxes? Property taxes go down because it's based on the market value. So your property tax will decrease. And I should let Mr. Urbicite say this, but I do want to point out the realtors don't pay the tax. I mean, it's going to hurt my members that are selling property there because the sales price will be down. But it's going to be the buyers, it's going to be the sellers that are going to end up having to pay it, I assume. So that's all. Is there any questions on the transfer tax?
Questions from Mr. Moline on the transfer tax from the committee?
Nope. Mr. Chairman, if I may, there's a couple other things. It was brought up about now I lost my notes, about having the countywide vote on sales tax initiatives. The point is I'd like to make is that I, as a county resident, if I go into the city of Laramie and buy goods, not groceries or cars, but I pay that sales tax. One of the reasons we want that as a countywide tax is not just a municipal tax. Me and a lot of my members out in the county, what services do we rely on greatly? We rely on city services, yes. We go into town, we drive on their streets. We also rely on the services provided by the county. And if it's just a municipal tax, the counties that are providing services to the members out in the hinterlands, the counties don't get as much funding. You think about fire protection. We pay in Albany County, we pay into a fire protection district, but also part of that cost, the sales tax going to the county can help some of the rural fire departments. If the sales tax is municipal only, it doesn't go to the counties, and they have less money for fire protection. County roads, most county roads are based on the fuel tax, but sometimes some of them can use that sales tax. If only municipalities, the towns, city, I hate that word, if only the cities and towns get the money, the counties will have less money. And police protection, also provided for most of us out in the counties by the county. Less money and sales tax will mean less money for the counties to help protect the citizens and provide other services. I do want to say thanks to Mr. Obermuller with the county commissioners. That his concept is one that is very intriguing to me. As you know, with Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, there's not a tax or fee increase that I can support as per my member policy. But as in many instances, our formal stance is no increase in taxes. But I think a sales tax would be less repugnant than an increase in any type of property tax. Property tax, we have the ability to pay valuation. It's not an exemption. It's a different methodology of calculating market value. But we also do pay the property taxes on our homesteads, our farmsteads, at the full market rate. So increasing that is not good. Increasing percentage, we cannot support that. That would be the most repugnant tax would be the real estate transfer tax. The second one would be the increase in property taxes. Not saying we would support it unless my members change their policy, but probably the least bad would be an increase in sales tax because that's based on what people spend. And yes, my households and my farmers and ranchers that are members and they have households, they do pay sales tax. With that, sir, I've gone on longer than I should have, and I will sit for any questions.
Questions from Mr. Moline on this topic? None? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anybody else in the public? Well, look who it is.
Changed my mind.
Mr. Chairman, Lori Erbkite representing the Wyoming Realtors, and of course we are totally opposed to any type of real estate transfer tax. Over the last 30 years, there have been numerous versions. They normally come every 6 years, but there have been ones where the buyers have to pay it. There's been ones where the sellers had to pay it. There's been, for the most recent ones, it's always been a county option or a voter option. We are still opposed to it. We are opposed to all of them. We will never support any type of new tax on real estate that is already taxed as property that will put another impediment in front of home ownership. And if you listen to the original or the earlier testimony proposing this tax, they even talked about how it would apply to workforce housing. Yes, workforce housing in Teton County is outrageously priced, but those people still need housing, and adding taxes on top of the cost already seems to be ridiculous. So again, we will always be opposed to the real estate transfer tax. We don't think it's good policy to impose to pass any legislation that's only going to affect 1 out of the 23 counties. And obviously, if it was going to affect all 23 counties, we'd be even more opposed to it if that would be possible. But on better news, Mr. Chairman, not wanting to leave a bad taste in your mouth, the Realtors, Fremont County Board of Realtors and the Wyoming Realtors would like to invite you to a reception this evening at Chopsticks, starting as soon as you're done with your work here. We'll have poo-poo trays, edamame, pot stickers, I'm not sure what else I ordered, soft drinks, beer, wine, and for those of you who are really brave, I believe they serve sake as well. So we hope you'll join us there at the conclusion of your work today.
Any questions for Mrs.
Andy is always welcome.
Any questions for Ms. Erbkite? Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else would like to testify on this subject? Transfer property tax, okay. We'll close public testimony then. Committee, what's your pleasure on this? On these items, yes. We've got some bills before us. Center case. Motion has been made to, what bill number was that?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not looking for a vote on that right now. I'd just like to trade for that's what I was
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we should continue this.
Keep it alive.
Mr. Chairman.
Motion has been made, second discussion. Representative Kenner.
Well, yeah, I guess my thought would be continue the discussion because we certainly put our Riverton mayor at a hard position, and I would really like to hear from WHAM and really get into that side of it as well, because that's 2/3 of that equation, or give or take. So anyway, I think that would allow WHAM to participate and be there before we were to move anything forward. So thank you.
Okay, further discussion on this? I think it was House Bill 125. Keep it alive until our next meeting. We can just pick it up again and hear more from WHAM. No further discussion?
You mean 287, don't you?
Hold on, Mr. Chairman, I'll get to that page. No, it's not 125.
That was the old one?
Yeah, that's the old one. It is the draft 18 LSO 2.
There it is, okay, I got you. Okay.
That one was a little bit more, Mr. Chairman, that one was a little bit more refined, and I think it was more workable and kind of benefited from some of our thinking on this.
Okay. Everybody has that, know what they're voting on. It's one LSO 287 draft point 3.
And Mr. Chairman, just to carry it forward to the next meeting for further discussion.
Right. Everybody understand what we're voting on? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Nope. No. Motion carries. That'll be carried over to our next meeting. Any further discussion on those topics of optional sales or optional taxes, local taxes? Nothing on the real estate transfer tax?
Yeah. I'm thinking about it.
Going once? Okay. Anything else before we adjourn? That was the last item on the agenda for. I thought we started at 8:30 this morning. Oh.
Well, you did.
I did.
There was an early version of the agenda that did say that.
Okay. I'm not totally wrong then.
No.
My co-chairman threw me a curve.
8:30.
Okay. If nothing else, then, committee members, we'll start tomorrow morning at 8:30 right here. Is this room going to be locked up so we can leave our items, or? I'd like to thank Wyoming PBS for being here today and helping us broadcast this, live stream it. Appreciate that. Appreciate your efforts. Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow morning then at 8:30.